Hey guys, tonight we're heading way back to a time when the pyramids were freshly built, perfume was made from crushed lilies, and the ultimate sign of love was carving someone's name on a clay pot. Yeah, we're talking ancient Egypt, love, marriage, passion, divorce, hauntings, you name it. And spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this if you're expecting modern romance. Think fewer chocolates, more crocodile-shaped love amulets. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I mean, I can't make you, but you'd be missing out on tales that go from sweet to completely cursed. Tell me, where are you watching from tonight? And what time is it in your corner of the world? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The sun beats down on your shoulders as you step out onto the bustling street of Thebes. It smells like dust, crushed herbs, and yesterday's goat stew. The Nile shimmers nearby, lazy and slow, and someone's shouting about melons. This is your world. Sand-coloured buildings, blue skies, and a whole lot of palm trees swaying like they've got secrets. Somewhere, a flute plays a soft tune, and around the corner, you spot someone who makes you forget every hieroglyph you've ever learned. Love in ancient Egypt isn't a grand affair with gowns and violins. It's more like a slow-cooked stew, built from shared routines, passing glances, and sometimes a very awkward offering of roasted duck. If you're lucky, you live in a neighbourhood where your crush walks by carrying water jugs every morning. If you're really lucky, you get up the courage to say hello without tripping over your own sandals. Perfume plays a surprisingly big role in flirting, the most desirable scent. Lotus blossom, steeped in oil until it clings to your skin like the Nile's own breath. Women smear it behind their ears, men dab it on their chests, and if you pass someone wearing it, you're basically inhaling the olfactory version of a love letter. Imagine the scent of river water mixed with jasmine and something slightly musky, like if summer had a favourite child. There's no Tinder here, but Egyptians had their own version of romantic expression, love poetry. Written on shards of limestone or scratched into potsherds, these verses range from genuinely touching to weirdly intense. One popular poem goes, "I am your first sister, your best one, more pleasing than all others." Yeah, the sibling thing? That's a whole different conversation for another night. Still, romance is alive in the air, even if it's dustier than you'd like. A scribe might spend hours composing the perfect phrase just to say, "Your voice is more beautiful than a harp." He might not actually play a harp, but hey, points for effort. And if you receive one of these poems, you're basically locked in, at least for a couple days, or until someone more poetic comes along. In cities like Memphis or Luxor, love unfolds in public markets and dusty alleyways, under the watchful eye of statues and cats. Always cats. Egyptians love their cats. You're never really alone. Even your crush might be casually carrying a kitten, just to raise their attractiveness level by 10 notches. And yet, there's a tenderness here. A certain sincerity in the way people look at each other. Courtship isn't grandiose, but it is personal. You exchange glances. Maybe you send a fig as a gift. Maybe you offer your fond. Finest palm wine. If you're really bold, you approach her father with your best goat and a handful of dates. Of course, love in Egypt isn't all sunshine and perfume. There's always the chance of running into a jealous rival. Maybe another scribe with more calligraphy flair. Maybe a merchant's son with 6 jars of honeys to your sad little one. And let's not forget the ever-present interference of gods. According to some beliefs, the goddess Hathor had her golden hand in all things love and beauty. If you suddenly feel butterflies or scarabs in your stomach when someone walks by, you can probably blame her. Fact. Ancient Egyptians believed in the power of the heart, not just as a metaphor, but literally. They thought your heart was the seat of your emotions, your intellect, and your morality. Your brain? Not important. They scooped that out during mummification like it was leftover hummus. But the heart stayed with you into the afterlife. So if you're in love, that emotion gets etched into your eternal soul. Sweet, right? Or terrifying, depending on how things go. Here's a quirk you didn't expect. Ancient Egyptians believed your scent could determine your romantic fate. It's one reason why scented cones, yes, cones made of fat and perfume, were perched on heads during parties. As they melted, they released fragrance. So you were trying to impress someone? You better hope your cone doesn't smell like fermented fish. Now, scholars still debate exactly how much emotion was tied to marriage. Was it really about love, or more about survival, stability, and producing kids who wouldn't grow up to curse your tomb? Some argue love was essential, others think it was more about forming practical alliances. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. Yes, people married for companionship, but they also really didn't want to die alone and have no one to do the proper burial rites. Still, the written poetry, the affectionate nicknames, my lotus, my sweet, my sister, of my heart, all suggest that genuine affection was deeply valued, even if it came wrapped in linen, sand, and the occasional overly dramatic sonnet. So here you are, in your loose linen tunic, sandals dusty from the road, your heart doing weird flips because someone just smiled at you by the well. The heat clings to you like memory, and all you can think is, how do I say something poetic that doesn't involve livestock or agricultural metaphors? And just like that, you're in love, or at least in serious like, and in ancient Egypt that's more than enough to get the story rolling. You see, love in ancient Egypt doesn't just unfold in the markets or behind olive trees, it's tangled in religion, dripping with divine fingerprints. Because here's the truth. In the land of pyramids and sacred beetles, falling in love isn't just a human thing, it's a god thing. Every little spark, every heartbeat flutter, every time you drop your bread because someone cute walked by, the ancient Egyptians believed that somewhere the gods are watching, and maybe even nudging things along with their celestial elbows. Start with Hathor. She's the big name on the romantic block. Goddess of love, beauty, music and joy, she's basically the Egyptian Aphrodite, but with more cow horns and a taste for dance parties. Her temples are adorned with carvings of lovers and musicians. People pray to her when their hearts ache or when their love life feels as dry as the Sahara. You might leave her an offering, a bit of sweet wine, some perfume, or even a lock of hair, hoping she'll bless you with a partner who doesn't snore like a dying ibis. But she's not the only divine matchmaker in town. There's also Bes, the squat lion-faced god of domestic happiness, childbirth, and, believe it or not, bedroom fun. Bes isn't pretty. In fact, he looks like a garden gnome that took a wrong turn into a nightmare. But he's beloved. His statues are tucked into bedrooms and painted on headboards, all to keep evil spirits and bad vibes away from your intimate life. Basically, he's the ancient world's ultimate third wheel, and you'll want him nearby if things start to get steamy. Love and marriage here feel predestined, like part of a divine blueprint. That's not to say you don't get a say. You do. But if things go well, you might hear people whisper that the gods brought you two together. If things go badly, you can always say the gods meant for you to learn a lesson. It's spiritual insurance either way. Now, one of the more surreal things about this divine romance theory is that it wasn't just metaphor. People believed that your actual personality, your likes, dislikes, even your romantic fate, was influenced by the divine forces active on the day you were born. Astrology? Nope. Try temple calendars and sacred festivals. Born during the Feast of Hathor? People assume you're a flirt with excellent taste in music. Born during a festival of Sekhmet, the warrior goddess? You might have trouble keeping partners because you keep threatening to bite them. One of the lesser-known details is that love rituals were sometimes carved into temple walls. Not the epic kind with battles and gods throwing lightning, but subtle moments. Couples sitting side by side sharing a cup of beer. The ancient Egyptian version of Netflix and chill was lotus wine and listen to a blind harpist. And maybe that harpist knows exactly the right song to make someone scoot a little closer on the bench. Now, here's a fun fringe detail. There were love festivals, real ones. The most famous, the Feast of the Beautiful Reunion. Once a year, Hathor's statue was carried from her temple in Dendera to meet her divine husband Horus in Edfu. It was a literal boat ride of love. Thousands of people would gather, drinking, dancing, singing, and yes, hooking up. Imagine Mardi Gras, but with more incense and fewer regrets, or at least fewer you could write down on a scroll. Even the gods themselves weren't immune to complicated relationships. Isis and Osiris are the poster couple of divine romance, married, in love, torn apart by betrayal, and still loyal beyond death. When Osiris is murdered and chopped into pieces by his jealous brother Set, Isis literally travels Egypt collecting his body parts. All of them, including the one you're thinking of. She reassembles him using magic, resurrects him briefly, and conceives Horus. That's dedication. It's also the ancient world's weirdest long-distance relationship. This tale wasn't just bedtime myth, it shaped real people's expectations. To love deeply was divine, to grieve with devotion was sacred, and to forgive betrayal, well, That depended on whether your lover was also a dismembered god or just someone who forgot your birthday. Here's the scholarly debate that still causes some eyebrow-raising in Egyptology circles. Just how literal did Egyptians take the idea of divine matchmaking? Were people really convinced that their spouse had been picked out by a goddess? Or was it more cultural poetry than actual belief? Some argue it was a psychological balm. If things were hard in your relationship, you could at least pretend a higher power was steering the chariot. Others believe these connections were invoked mostly in rituals and festivals, not everyday love. The truth's a little dusty, buried under layers of mythology and daily grind, but the symbols are there, etched into tombs, painted on walls, whispered into prayer offerings. Still, the feeling persists. Love is not just a personal matter in this world, it's part of your fate, your community, your standing with the divine. When you fall in love, you're not just dealing with your own heart, you're inviting the entire spiritual cosmos into the conversation, which might explain why you've got that nervous pit in your stomach. It's not just butterflies, it's probably best making faces in your dreams. So imagine it. You're walking home after catching sight of someone at the linen market. The sky's pink and orange, the air thick with the scent of frankincense and heat. You pass a small shrine to Hathor, leave a sliver of bread on the altar, and whisper a wish into the stone. Let her smile at me tomorrow. Not a demand, just a hope, a soft prayer drifting upward like smoke. And maybe, just maybe, the gods are listening. You wake up early the next morning with that weird, restless energy, the kind that makes you hum while fetching water and suddenly care how your tunic fits across your shoulders. You're definitely not hoping to run into someone. You know the one. The girl with the ankle bangles and the laugh that sounds like rippling papyrus leaves. Or maybe it's that scribe with hands stained from ink, who looks like he's always thinking of something clever and probably knows all the love poems by heart. This is where Egyptian flirting begins. And no, it's not all dramatic eye contact over temple steps and perfumed fan waves. Most of it starts right here, on dusty roads, in barley fields, during shared chores. It's slow, casual, half-said things that could be mistaken for jokes if they're not received well. There are no grand romantic speeches. Instead, there's banter over bread, teasing while picking figs, and awkward glances that linger too long before looking away again. The poetry of flirting in ancient Egypt. Agricultural. Like, very agricultural. You don't compliment someone's eyes, you say, "Your gaze is like sunlight on a field of wheat." You don't praise their walk, you compare it to the swaying of ripe barley. Want to tell someone they make your heart flutter? Try, "My heart digs like a hoe in dry soil when I see you." Romantic? In a mud and grain kind of way, yes. And surprisingly, it works. There's a particular love poem from the New Kingdom that describes a lover's anxiety as a storm inside the chest, like a kind of internal weather system. Egyptians didn't just feel things, they built whole symbolic ecosystems around them. If someone says your presence brings on the flood, that's not a complaint. It's the biggest compliment in the Nile Valley. It means you are life-giving, unavoidable, and kind of dangerous during planting season. It wasn't all metaphor, though. Sometimes gestures spoke louder than any poetic grain reference. Want to catch someone's attention? Show up with a piece of fresh fish. Yes, fish. Dried, smoked, salted. Fish meant effort. It meant waking up early, negotiating at the docks, and not eating it yourself on the way over. That's love. Or you could offer a cone of scented fat, a polished stone, or even a small bronze charm shaped like a frog. Cute and slightly confusing, just like early stage crushes. Men often took the lead in writing, but don't let that fool you. Women weren't passive flowers waiting to be picked. In Egyptian society, women had more freedom than in many ancient cultures. They could own property, initiate divorce, run businesses, and yes, flirt first. A woman might show interest with a song, a touch of perfume, or an artfully dropped linen kerchief. If she really liked you, she might carve a little something into a pottery shard, just initials maybe, or a symbol, and leave it somewhere you'd find it. The ancient version of sliding into your DMs. And here's the strange, delightful twist. Flirting wasn't seen as shameful. It was part of life, part of joy. Egyptians celebrated the pleasures of the heart and the body. They didn't hide behind shame or austerity. Their gods laughed, danced, and made love. Their stories overflowed with passion and playfulness. Desire wasn't a thing to conquer. It was a thing to enjoy. Still, it wasn't a free-for-all. If you were a young noble, there were expectations. You couldn't just marry the fish seller's daughter no matter how much she smelled like cinnamon and sass. Class, status, and family reputation mattered. But feelings, they still found ways to creep in. Behind every rigid scroll of family expectations was someone daydreaming under a palm tree about a different kind of future. And in the fields, among the workers and servants and scribes, love bloomed more freely. Without the weight of legacy and inheritance, you could fall for someone because they made you laugh while washing clothes in the river. You could meet your partner picking lettuce and spend your days laughing over who forgot to oil the door hinge again. That's not to say it was easy. Poverty, disease, and social limits still existed. But within that, people carved out moments of joy. Real joy. Sand between the toes, sun on your face, can't stop thinking about them kind of joy. Fringe fact, there's evidence that some flirty moments involved actual tickling. Yes, tickling. One love poem describes a woman longing to tickle her lover's foot while he napped in the sun. What starts as adorable quickly becomes a highly specific kink. But hey, consensual foot tickling under an acacia tree? Live your life. Now, scholars still argue about how personal these relationships really were. Was love always part of the deal? Or was marriage primarily a contract with occasional emotional bonuses? Some argue that the affectionate verses were more poetic license than reality, that most marriages were pragmatic arrangements, but others point to the tenderness in tomb inscriptions, the domestic scenes, the love songs passed down through generations. They argue that while how love was expressed might have been different, the presence of love was deeply real. Think about it. If people carved images of themselves sitting beside their spouse in eternity, forever side by side with arms around shoulders, would they do that for someone they didn't care about? Unlikely. Even if emotions weren't shouted from rooftops or painted in neon, they lived in the soft edges, the casual gesture, the bent knee stance beside your partner's tomb figure, the way your names are linked with a simple beloved of. So now it's dusk again. The sun slips behind the western hills where it's said the dead travel. But you're still here, breathing in the warm evening air, your arms full of laundry or fish or scrolls. And you see them again. The person who made your chest do that ridiculous flood thing. They smile. You wave. There's no need for speeches or scrolls tonight. Just a glance that lasts a beat too long. Tomorrow, maybe you offer them a fig, or a flower, or you write something ridiculous about how their hair reminds you of the wind in grain silos. You've got time, and plenty of metaphors. The thing about love in ancient Egypt is that it doesn't always stay private. Sure, your feelings might start out tucked safely in your chest, coiled like a reed scroll, but give it enough time and suddenly the whole neighbourhood knows you're crushing. That's just how things work here. Word travels through walls made of mud brick and gossip flows faster than the Nile at flood time. And where does most of this matchmaking magic happen? Not in grand temples or royal courts. Those are for politics and gods. Real romantic sparks fly in the humblest places. The crowded markets, the weaving huts, the alleyways where people squat on low stools, dicing onions and exchanging glances. If you're looking for love, don't bother with the palace. Head to the fishmongers, the spice stalls, the edge of the river where people come to wash clothes and secrets float just beneath the surface. You pass rows of merchants shouting over each other, trying to sell baskets of lentils, loaves of bread still warm from the clay oven, dried figs pressed into little squares. The smells hit you in waves. Roasted duck, date syrup, hot sand. Somewhere nearby, a woman is laughing too loudly, which means she probably just got flirted with and actually liked it. There's a rhythm to the market, clatter, chatter, clink of pottery. Maybe a lute being strummed by a bored teenager hoping someone cute passes by. And it's here, between stacks of garlic and a barrel of pickled fish, that you spot them again, your maybe love interest. They're arguing with a vendor about the weight of their cucumbers, and they look beautiful doing it. You pretend to be interested in a basket of onions until they notice you. They do, you smile, they smile, and then it's back to cucumbers. But everything's changed. Egyptian cities like Thebes and Memphis were built for these tiny casual moments. Winding alleys, communal courtyards, rooftop staircases. It's all designed to maximise interaction. Even rural villages have tight-knit clusters of homes where everybody knows who's visiting whom, and no one can slip by unnoticed. Your love life isn't just your business, it's community entertainment. And it turns out your neighbours are not subtle. You buy something you don't need just to stay in the market a little longer. Maybe a strand of beads or a too ripe pomegranate. You catch bits of conversation, half about politics, half about that time the baker's daughter was seen holding hands behind the granary. People love a scandal, especially if it involves someone sneaking kisses near a shrine. And yes, shrines are absolutely a hotspot for romantic meetups. Nothing says let's make this spiritual like a quick chat beside a limestone statue of Thoth. Romance in the market isn't just visual, it's auditory. You hear affection in tone, in the back and forth bartering, in the way someone says you again, like it's both an accusation and a compliment. Some flirtations unfold slowly over days, weeks. You come back to the same stall, ask about the same dates, make the same dumb joke about papyrus prices. Eventually, you share a smile that lasts a second too long. Maybe you walk them home. Maybe you don't. Not yet. One fringe detail. In some villages, love songs were actually performed at the markets. Wandering singers would recite poetry sometimes improvised based on who they saw walking together. Think of it as public serenading, ancient style. It's romantic until someone sings about your soft belly like a jar of beer foam in front of your mum. Now, here's the twist. Despite how public these flings might seem, there's still an enormous amount of tact involved. The Egyptians were masters of the almost said, the nearly touch. Physical affection in public, rare. A handbrush might be the most scandalous thing that happens between the pomegranate stand and the donkey pen. But behind all the modesty, the signals are loud, just not always the ones you expect. A shared drink, a flower tucked behind the ear, an extra sweet deal on lentils. All of it speaks volumes. Sometimes it doesn't even need to be face to face. You hear stories about people leaving little gifts outside doorways, bread, scented oil, tiny notes scratched onto pottery shards. You might wake up one morning to find a strip of dyed linen draped across your door handle, which either means someone loves you, or that your neighbour's laundry blew loose again. Still, you check for a name, just in case. This brings us to the ongoing scholarly debate about the role of class in these love stories. While most of the records we have are from elite scribes and nobles, because poor people's stories rarely made it onto stone, there's increasing evidence that market-level romances weren't just tolerated, they were part of daily life. Some argue that these relationships offered the most authentic glimpse into Egyptian emotional life. No inheritance at stake, no priestly expectations, just two people, a basket of figs, and a shared joke. Of course, it wasn't always smooth. Some markets were notorious for drama. Fights broke out, rivalries formed, people left love poems anonymously, only to be humiliated when the recipient guessed wrong and thanked the wrong person. There's a tale scratched onto an ostracon, basically ancient fanfiction, that tells of a woman who pretended to be interested in 3 brothers at once, just to get free meat. She ended up with a bruised ego and a lifetime ban from the butcher's stall. Worth it? Debatable. But for all the chaos, the market remains the heartbeat of everyday romance. It's messy, loud and unpredictable, just like love. You finish your shopping with too much garlic and not enough decorum. You bump into your person again, this time near the spice jars. They ask what you're cooking. You lie and say something exotic. They laugh and suggest beer bread. You nod like that's what you meant all along. There's a pause, tiny, loaded. Then they hand you a small jar of honey. On the house, they say. You don't ask if it's a gift. You don't need to. It's not just honey. It's an invitation. Later that night, after the streets have emptied and even the donkeys seem to be sighing in their sleep, you're lying on a mat staring at the ceiling holding that little jar of honey. It's sticky, slightly leaking, and smell like the inside of a sun-warmed fig. And now you can't sleep. Not really. Not with your head full of too many thoughts and your heart thudding like a ceremonial drum. What do you even do with this? With this honey, this gesture, this ancient Egyptian version of, hey, I kinda like you? Well, if you're smart, and you are smart, you write a poem. Poetry in ancient Egypt wasn't just for festivals or funerals. It was everyday magic. A soft spell you cast when words weren't enough on their own. Everyone from scribes to servants knew how to turn a feeling into metaphor. And if you're feeling bold tonight, you reach for a shard of pottery, dip a reed pen into a bit of ink, and try to capture your thoughts without sounding too desperate. Good luck. You start with something simple. Maybe, my heart is like a Nile boat when I see you. Full, bobbing, unsteady. Then you cross that out because it makes you sound seasick. You try again. Your smile makes the sun embarrassed. No, too dramatic. Finally, you settle on something weird but oddly sincere. When you walk past me, my knees forget how to be knees. It's not elegant, but it's honest. Poems like this exist in fragments across time. On limestone chips, papyrus scraps, even the occasional wall, lovers scrawled their longing in the only language they trusted: metaphor. There's one found in the ruins of a village called Deir el Medina that reads, "I wish I were your laundryman just to wash the clothes that touch your body." Which is either romantic or deeply creepy depending on the tone, but hey, it was heartfelt. Another favourite from that same era: "She has stolen my heart with her hair, her neck, her arms, and I do not know how to recover." Honestly, same. These weren't grand declarations made to crowds. They were secret confessions, sometimes never shared with anyone, sometimes slipped into hands wrapped around jars of honey. And it wasn't just men writing them either. Women composed love poetry too. Soft, sensual, and sometimes shockingly forward. One woman's poem opens with, "I want to meet you in secret, far from our houses." This wasn't demure courtship, it was desire, clear, unapologetic, and blooming like blue lotus flowers at dawn. Speaking of the lotus, that's another symbol that appears constantly in Egyptian love writing. The blue lotus was more than just a pretty flower. It was sensual, intoxicating, and known to have mildly psychoactive properties. You'd steep it in wine, inhale its petals, use its scent in perfume. When someone called you a lotus in poetry, they were saying you were rare, beautiful, and probably capable of turning heads in both life and the afterlife. You might wonder, who taught them to write like this? Where did these metaphors come from? The answer, as always, is a mix of culture, religion, and long evenings under the stars. Writing was a sacred skill, and scribes were trained not just in law and bookkeeping, but in the art of expression. They copied proverbs, hymns, and yes, love poems. Schools of scribes had entire sections devoted to romantic writing, because even in a society built on order and rituals, they understood that people fall apart over other people. Here's a quirky little detail. Some poems were performed with instruments. Imagine you're sitting at a courtyard party, sipping barley beer, and someone starts playing a lyre and reciting verse about being drenched in your fragrance as if perfumed by incense from Punt. You might blush, you might pretend to look away while listening very carefully, because if you're lucky, the poem is about you. This all leads into a juicy scholarly debate. Were these poems purely artistic, or were they used in actual courtship? Did people really hand each other verses scratched onto pottery shards? Or were these elite amusements, crafted by and for the literate few? Some academics argue the poems were more for performance, ritualized displays of love rather than real confessions. Others point to how intimate and specific some verses are, like diary entries never meant to be heard aloud. Truthfully, it's probably both. Some were crafted to impress, others were personal, maybe even desperate. In any case, they reflect something universal, the desire to translate emotion into language, the ache of wanting to say, "You've unsettled me in the best way," in a form that feels timeless, sacred, and just a little bit clever. You finish your poem, it's messy, ink-blotted, slightly embarrassing, but it's yours. Maybe you'll leave it near the honey jar when you return it. Maybe you'll roll it up and burn it, whispering the words to the night instead. Or maybe you'll just read it a dozen times in your head, imagining how they might smile if they ever saw it. It's quiet now, the village is asleep. You hear the distant hoot of an owl, symbol of wisdom, keeper of the secrets, and the soft rustle of palm fronds outside your window. You roll onto your side, still clutching your words, and let sleep come. In the morning, maybe you'll see them again at the market. Maybe not. But for now, you've done something powerful. You've carved a piece of your longing into the universe. You've joined a chorus of voices echoing across 3,000 years, and you've proven something important. No matter the time or place, love always finds a way to turn feelings into verse. The next morning, before the sun has fully crested the desert hills, you're already awake. You're nervous, which isn't ideal when trying to act casual. You've combed your hair, splashed yourself with a bit of river water that hopefully doesn't smell like frog, and even rubbed a thin line of scented oil along your neck. Not the fancy stuff, you're not royalty, but enough to say I tried. And tucked in the fold of your linen sash is that poem, folded, smudged, and slightly embarrassing. You're ready to make your move, or rather, your not-a-move move. Which brings us to something critical. In ancient Egypt, getting married was both the easiest and most complicated thing in the world. There's no official ceremony, no priest with a booming voice, no temple vows, no big public spectacle involving dancing girls and 6 kinds of cheese. In fact, if you're expecting a full-on wedding day with flower crowns and harp solos, you're going to be sorely underwhelmed. Egyptians didn't technically married, at least not in the ritualistic way you're imagining. What they did instead was move in together. That's right, marriage in ancient Egypt was more of a mutual agreement than a religious ritual. If 2 people decided to live under the same roof, sleep in the same bed, and share household duties, then congrats, they were married. The end. No license, no ceremony, no awkward best man speech. Just 2 people, some domestic cohabitation, and maybe a shared goat. This kind of informal arrangement wasn't scandalous. It was normal. Egyptians valued domestic harmony and mutual respect more than grand declarations. Sure, wealthier couples might record their union in writing, especially if property or inheritance was involved, but that wasn't required. A peasant girl and a potter's apprentice could just decide one day, hey, let's not live separately anymore, and that was that. Congratulations, you're married now, better start arguing about where to store the barley. Now when this move-in moment happened, there were still rituals involved, just smaller, more personal ones. There might be gifts exchanged between families, jars of oil, bread, fabric, maybe even a pig or 2, depending on how generous or strategic people were feeling. And there'd almost certainly be a feast. Egyptians loved a good party, so even if the marriage wasn't religiously sanctioned, there'd be food, beer, and a lot of people trying to guess if the couple would last through planting season. One fringe detail that turns up in a few texts and tomb paintings is that sometimes, especially in wealthier circles, a symbolic procession might take place. The bride would be brought to the groom's house, possibly accompanied by musicians or a gaggle of nosy relatives, and her arrival would be marked with dancing, clapping, and something called house blessings. These blessings were half prayer, half stand-up comedy, full of wishes for fertility, loyalty, and not too much snoring. But in the vast majority of cases, it was simple. Domestic life began when 2 people started sharing chores and stopped pretending to sleep alone. You build a little home together. Maybe you borrow some palm mats from your aunt. Maybe your mother-in-law drops off a jug of olive oil and 15 pieces of unsolicited advice. You hang your best woven basket near the door and hope your neighbours stop walking by so slowly and peering in like it's a tourist attraction. This simplicity came with freedom. Divorce was just as informal. If either partner decided the arrangement wasn't working, they could separate without a judge or a fight. If there were kids or property involved, that got a little more complicated, we'll get to that. But in general, Egyptians approached marriage less like a binding trap and more like a working partnership, which is kind of revolutionary when you think about it. Of course, for the elite and royal classes, things got trickier. Contracts, dowries, and negotiations weren't just common, they were expected. A high-status woman might bring land, livestock, or servants into a marriage. A wealthy man might offer gold, imported oils, or rare fabrics. In those cases, a scribe would draft a formal agreement, which outlined each party's responsibilities and what would happen in the case of separation. But for most people, you just showed up and started sharing lentils. And here's the academic debate. Was this simplicity empowering or limiting? Some argue that the lack of official religious oversight allowed more egalitarian relationships to form. Others suggest it may have left women vulnerable, especially in disputes. There's evidence both ways. Some wives clearly held considerable power within their homes, managing estates, running businesses, even testifying in court. Others may have faced pressures to stay in unsatisfying partnerships due to economic necessity. Like most things in history, it wasn't one size fits all. What's fascinating is how marriage was portrayed in art. In tomb paintings, couples are often shown side by side, facing the same direction, hands gently touching or arms around one another. The imagery suggests a kind of closeness that wasn't just about producing heirs, it was about shared life, shared bread, shared laughter, maybe even a shared snore or 2. And then there's the house itself. A typical Egyptian home was made of sun-dried mud brick with thick walls to keep out the heat. Inside you'd have a few small rooms, a place to cook, a place to sleep, maybe a rooftop area for drying laundry and whispering secrets. Furnishings were simple, woven mats, clay pots, palm frond baskets. If you were lucky, you had your own oven. If you were really lucky, you didn't have to share a bathroom with 3 other families. You and your partner probably had separate sleeping mats at first, just until things settled. But within a few weeks, you're sleeping head to toe, back to back, trying to avoid rolling onto each other in the middle of the night. You wake to the sounds of roosters and gossip, stretch out your limbs, and realise this is what marriage looks like. Not a vow, but a rhythm. So tonight, as you set down your poetry, tuck away the honey jar, and glance at that empty space beside your mat, you start to wonder, what would it be like to wake up and find someone already there? Not just for a night, but every morning after, sharing space, sharing laughter, sharing your last piece of bread when supplies run low. In ancient Egypt, love didn't need permission. It just needed a door open wide enough for two. So let's say things go well. You've exchanged glances, traded poetry, and maybe even shared a mug of beer under the stars. Eventually, the two of you decide it's time to make things official, or, well, Egyptian official, which mostly means agreeing to live together and start splitting the chores. But here's where things start to get interesting, because while you may not need a priest or a ceremony, you do need to talk about gifts, and not just any gifts, we're talking the bride price. Now don't get nervous, this isn't some auction block horror story. In ancient Egypt, the bride price, called the sunut, wasn't about purchasing a woman like a goat at the market. It was more of a symbolic offering, a gesture of goodwill from the groom's family to the bride's. Think of it like a polite, hey, thanks for letting us ruin your laundry schedule with this guy. The gift varied based on class and resources. If you were wealthy, it might be jewellery, gold rings, or finely woven linen. If you were a bit more modest, it could be livestock, beer, or a couple of ducks that don't bite. The idea was to compensate the bride's household for the loss of her labour, which sounds cold until you remember this is a society where every hand counts. A daughter leaving the home meant fewer arms to grind grain, fetch water, or help her mother pretend not to gossip. The sunut helped ease that transition, both emotionally and economically. And while the amount and type of gift were negotiable, offering something was basically non-negotiable if you wanted to look like a serious suitor and not some guy who just wandered in off the Nile. But wait, because the bride price wasn't the only gift on the table. There was also the dowry, and now we're in double gift territory. Unlike the senate, the dowry came from the bride's son. Usually, her family would provide her with household goods to bring into the new home. We're talking cooking pots, woven mats, perhaps some palm baskets, and if her family was well off, maybe a cow or two. Not the glamorous part of love, but definitely the practical one. These weren't wedding gifts from guests. They were the tools of survival, packed up and carried across town as part of her new life. Sometimes the bride would even bring property, land or a small business, depending on how savvy her family was. And here's the kicker. Anything the woman brought into the marriage remained hers. That's right. Ancient Egyptian women had property rights. In fact, one of the more progressive legal quirks of this culture is that women could own, manage, sell and bequeath property in their own names. So if you were marrying a woman with a vineyard, you were essentially becoming the husband of a small wine empire. Better behave. Now, these exchanges weren't always simple. Sometimes there were drawn-out negotiations, especially if the couple came from different social classes. A middle-class man marrying a noble woman? He might have to offer more than just a basket of dried figs and a good personality. A powerful family didn't want their daughter walking into a home with no roof and a single goat with attitude. The gifts weren't just for show, they were about status, preparation, and security. And sometimes, if the couple had already, let's say, jumped the queue romantically, the negotiations got even trickier. There are records of grooms scrambling to offer generous bride prices after pregnancies occurred before formal cohabitation. In those cases, the sunut became a kind of retroactive proof of good intentions. See, I was going to marry her anyway. Sometimes it worked. Other times, the angry father still chased the groom through the village with a pestle. Ah, love. Fringe fact, in some regions, symbolic gifts weren't just practical, they were a weird blend of sentimental and superstitious. One known example is gifting an amulet shaped like a lion's paw, meant to bless the union with strength and fertility. Another popular token was a fertility figurine made from faience, a bright blue ceramic material that sparkled in the sun. Think of it as giving someone a lucky charm that also says, let's have a lot of babies, okay? The actual delivery of these gifts varied by region. Sometimes the items were walked in a small parade to the bride's new home. Sometimes they were quietly handed over, one pot at a time, with as much ceremony as unloading groceries. In wealthier families, scribes recorded the transaction in meticulous detail. 1 chest of linens, 3 jars of honey, 2 combs and a necklace of carnelian beads. It wasn't about romance, it was about keeping receipts. Ancient Egyptian prenups, essentially. And here's where the scholarly debate kicks in. Were these gifts about love or business? Some researchers argue that Egyptian marriage was less about emotion and more about practical alliances, especially among the upper classes. Families married into each other for land, political favour, or social clout. Love was secondary, or maybe even irrelevant. But others point out the deep affection shown in art and text, shared tombs, mutual inscriptions, intimate poetry. The truth likely sits somewhere in the middle. Love may have sparked the match, but gifts kept the match running. Back in your reality, though, the conversation about gifts is going, okay, you're at the edge of your family courtyard, your friend nervously holding a jar of sesame oil like it's an offering to a short-tempered god. You've already asked your cousin to lend you his goat just for show, and your uncle keeps muttering that he gave up a perfectly good pot of date wine when he got married, and you should too. Eventually both families meet. There's talking, there's bargaining, and someone tells a long, unnecessary story about how many loaves of bread their great-uncle gave for his third wife. You try not to fall asleep standing. Finally, there's a nod, a handshake, and the exchange is done. A goat is promised. 2 jars of honey are delivered. A bundle of fine linen is accepted with a curt nod. You've just taken your first real step into married life. Not with rings, not with a first dance, but with gifts, gestures, and a silent understanding that this thing you're building is worth investing in. And later that night, when your partner unwraps the necklace you spent 2 weeks bartering for, a simple piece of shell and turquoise, you see it in their face. This isn't just a trade, it's a promise. So you've made it through the negotiations without losing your dignity, your goat, or your family's trust. Congratulations. You're now officially, unofficially married. There was no ceremony, no high priest waving incense around, no elaborate procession with crocodile dancers, just an exchange of goods, a nod of agreement, and maybe a couple of shy smiles across the courtyard. And now you're standing in front of your new home, your very own slice of mud brick paradise, with a bundle of palm fronds, a second-hand mat, and your mother whispering last-minute advice that sounds suspiciously like thinly veiled warnings. It's not a palace. It's not even big enough to throw a stick in without hitting something. But it's yours. 2 or 3 rooms at most, each one no bigger than a decent-sized closet. Thick, sun-baked mud brick walls to keep out the desert heat, and small slit windows high up to let in the breeze without giving your neighbours an unfiltered view of your morning yawns. The door creaks a little. It's wood, slightly warped, and there's a faint smell of old onions and new straw. You step in, and your life together officially begins. Inside, the layout's simple. There's a main room where most of your life happens, sleeping, eating, arguing over who forgot to refill the oil lamp. Off to one side, a smaller space functions as the kitchen, although that's generous. It's basically a corner with a few clay pots, a fire pit, and your collection of worn cooking tools. If you're lucky, there's a rooftop area you can climb onto using stairs that double as a great spot for people watching or private chats under the stars. The furnishings are humble. A couple of woven mats to sleep on, a low table or 2, some reed baskets stuffed with clothes, and maybe, if someone splurged, a painted chest to store your few valuables. There's no bed frame, no mattress, no curtains billowing dramatically in the breeze. Just practical things that have already seen too many summers, and you trying to figure out how 2 people are supposed to live in one space without tripping over each other's sandals. Domestic life in ancient Egypt isn't glamorous. It's dusty. It's loud. And it is very much a team effort. One of you might be a scribe or a weaver, the other perhaps works in the fields, or brews beer, or manages the household. There's no housewife label per se, but there is division of labour, though it's fluid. You both fetch water, you both grind grain, you both wash your own linen unless you're lucky enough to afford help, and even then you're the one yelling instructions from across the room. One of the first shared rituals you take on? Lighting the home's protective charms. A painted amulet gets placed above the door, maybe a little figure of Bess, the household protector, his tongue sticking out like he's daring evil spirits to even try something. Incense might be burned, prayers muttered under your breath. You're not religious in the temple-goer sense, but you're not about to skip this. You've heard the stories, how forgetting to bless the doorway could lead to broken jars, marital spats, or even scorpions in the bedding. No thank you. And then there's the kitchen dance. The two of you figure out over time who cooks best, who seasons things like they're secretly mad at your ancestors, and who can keep the fire going without producing a house full of smoke. Meals are simple but satisfying. Flatbread, lentils, onions, maybe dried fish, or bits of meat if you're lucky. You sit on mats and eat with your hands, fingers stained with oil and spice. No plates, just shared bowls and the rhythm of chewing in sync. Evenings are quiet mostly. There's no Netflix obviously, but there are songs, shared stories, and the gentle percussion of neighbours fighting in the distance. You might recite a love poem you remember from youth, or hum a tune while they braid your hair. It's intimacy without theatrics. You laugh over the shape of a funny-looking fig. You argue about whose turn it is to fetch more water. Sometimes that's all love needs. Fringe fact: some newlywed homes featured tiny offering spaces or wall niches for the couple's personal gods. These weren't grand altars, just little shelves with clay figures, perhaps a dried lotus, and a splash of beer left each evening. A humble divine, thanks for not letting us kill each other today. Now, let's not pretend everything's perfect. Living together is hard. There are days when the roof leaks, the lentils burn, and your spouse is being extra annoying about where the comb should go. You miss your mother's bread. They miss having their own corner to sleep in. And yet something starts to settle. A routine. A partnership. The sound of their footsteps becomes familiar. The way they hum while kneading dough starts to feel like home. And scholars are still trying to pin down exactly how affectionate these early days were. Some argue that marriage was more of a contract, a domestic arrangement designed for survival. Others point to the art, the letters, the poetry, and insist that emotional closeness was real and valued. Tombs from working-class couples often depict spouses holding hands, sitting side by side with little animals at their feet and shared offerings on their altars. That's not just utility, that's intimacy. You also start to build a shared reputation. In the neighbourhood, you're no longer that scribe who smells like ink and nervous sweat. You're part of a couple now. People talk. They note how often you go to market together, whether you laugh during errands or scowl, whether your cooking smells good or possibly cursed. One day, an older neighbour says, "You two remind me of a pair of ibis birds, always side by side." It's probably the nicest thing anyone's ever said about your relationship. And in the quietest moments, when the lamps are low and the night has wrapped the house in soft shadows, you realise something. You know how this person breathes. You know their rhythm. The way they mutter in sleep. The way they reach for you without fully waking up. You may not have stood under an altar. You may not have exchanged vows before a god. But in your little house, among the baskets and laughter and oil lamps, you've made a promise that's just as sacred. This is your life now, not dramatic, not perfect, but real. And it's just getting started. The sun sinks behind the western hills, painting the sky in streaks of copper and rose, and inside your little home the air is warm and heavy. Tonight's different. You feel it in the way your partner moves around the room, a bit quieter, a bit more deliberate. There's a fresh woven mat on the floor, the good linen pulled from the chest, and a scent hanging in the air that's definitely not lentils. Is that myrrh? Someone went all out. Because tonight, dear listener, is your first night together, the ancient Egyptian version of a wedding night. You won't find candles or flower petals or slow music from a hidden harpist, but that doesn't mean there's no ceremony to it. Egyptians may not have had elaborate weddings, but the first night under the same roof, that's something worth preparing for, spiritually, physically, supernaturally. You're not just getting undressed, you're trying not to offend the gods, wake the dead, or get cursed by a passing demon. First things first, amulets, lots of them. You wear one, your partner wears one, there might be one tucked under the mat, another hung from the wall, and possibly a protective spell scratched into a potsherd sitting discreetly in the corner. This isn't because you're bad at romance, it's because ancient Egyptians lived in a world where magic was part of everyday life. And the bedroom, that's where things could get vulnerable, spiritually exposed. So you protect yourself the same way you do when you cross the Nile or harvest in the dark, with a little divine insurance. Bess, the grinning dwarf-like household god, takes centre stage here. He's not attractive. Actually, he's a kind of terrifying with his lion mane and bulging eyes. But you want him around. He's the protector of sleep, childbirth, and deep bedroom activities. His face is carved into headboards, painted on walls, even etched onto spoons. A statue of Bess leering from a shelf might seem like a mood killer, but in ancient Egypt it's the opposite. He's the ultimate wingman. And if you hear a weird noise during your evening festivities, you whisper a quick prayer to him and carry on. Now, you may be picturing this night as some romantic slow dance under torchlight. In reality, it's probably a little awkward, slightly funny, and maybe over a bit faster than either of you expected. You're tired. You've been moving all day, you're not sure where to put your arm. The bed creaks, there's sand in weird places, and you're both kind of wondering if the neighbours can hear anything. They can. This is Egypt. Walls are thin and people are nosy, but that's part of it. The humour, the fumbling, the way you laugh after bumping heads or knocking over a basket. It's all part of the transition from courtship to cohabitation. There's a tenderness that grows from that vulnerability, not just the physical kind, but the emotional kind. You're here, together, in this small, hot room with a half-burnt oil lamp and a way too many nervous thoughts, and still, you reach for each other. Now let's talk about the symbolic side. Scholars believe that sex in marriage wasn't just about reproduction or pleasure, it had layers. In Egyptian thought, physical intimacy was tied to cosmic harmony. The union of two people, particularly when done with love and consent, mirrored the uniting forces of male and female divine energies. Think Isis and Osiris, Ra and Hathor, Nut and Geb, the sky and the earth embracing to keep the world spinning. When you share this moment with your partner, you're not just doing it for yourselves, you're playing a tiny sacred part in the balance of the universe. No pressure. Some wealthier households went even further, preparing the room with symbols of fertility. Lotus flowers, pomegranates, polished mirrors. Mirrors were especially important. Not just for checking your hair, though, yes, absolutely that too, but as magical tools. Their smooth, reflective surfaces were thought to ward off evil spirits and attract divine protection. So tonight, there's probably a bronze mirror leaning somewhere nearby, catching the flicker of your oil lamp like a quiet, shiny witness. Fringe fact? There's evidence that some couples used perfumed cones placed atop their heads during their first night together. Yes, literal cones of scented fat slowly melting and releasing fragrance. It sounds bizarre now, but it was sensual, ceremonial, and slightly hilarious. Imagine trying to be seductive while a blob of jasmine-infused wax drips down your forehead. Romantic or not, it was very much a thing. Now, not every first night is a spiritual awakening. Sometimes it's just clumsy and sweet, followed by cuddling under a shared sheet and the hum of distant insects. Other times there's anxiety, especially if this is your first time or if you're trying to conceive right away. Fertility mattered in ancient Egypt. Producing children wasn't just about family pride, it was a sacred duty. Children ensured your name lived on, your tomb was tended, your afterlife was secure. So yeah, some pressure. That said, intimacy wasn't purely transactional. There are countless references, poetic, artistic, personal, that suggest couples shared genuine affection. One inscription shows a couple holding hands, reclining together, with a caption that reads, "She who gladdens his heart daily." Not exactly Kama Sutra, but deeply human. In a world where so much was uncertain, weather, harvests, political shifts, this kind of steady emotional bond mattered. And here's where historians still argue. How much of this intimacy was private versus performative? Did couples share these moments away from public view, or were expectations shaped by family, neighbours, even household servants? Some say that the home was a sanctuary, a place of emotional freedom. Others argue it was yet another stage where you played out your role, complete with rituals, superstitions and unspoken rules. Tonight, though, you're not thinking about scholarship or cosmic unions. You're thinking about the softness of your partner's breath, the quiet laughter between kisses, the way they whisper your name like it's a spell. Maybe it is. Afterward, you lay in the quiet, the scent of oil and warmth still in the air. There's a clay jar half full of water beside the bed, a palm fan hanging limply from the wall, and the sound of frogs chirping outside. You feel the slow unravelling of nerves, the settling in of something new, not just physical satisfaction, but closeness, trust, a shared silence that doesn't need to be filled. You close your eyes. Somewhere, a little clay figurine of Bess grins in the shadows. You've just passed one of the most intimate thresholds in ancient Egyptian life, not with pomp or grandeur, but with awkward grace and a sense that somehow, this moment will echo for a long, long time. Now that the first night has come and gone, complete with melted perfume cones, awkward elbow placement, and a lot of nervous giggling, it's time to settle into something far more complex than scented rituals and sleepy after-goes. Welcome to monogamy, mostly. In ancient Egypt, the ideal of marriage was fairly straightforward. One man, one woman, one household. Simple, clean, manageable. That's what most Egyptians believed in and aimed for. But because there's always a but, there were plenty of exceptions. And depending on who you were and how many goats you owned, your version of marital or married might get a little expanded. Let's start with the average Egyptian, the farmer, the scribe, the brewer's daughter. In most of these households, monogamy was the rule. Two people committed to sharing a home, raising children, and trying not to strangle each other over burnt bread. Love, companionship, and domestic cooperation were the name of the game. Adultery was frowned upon, and while the society wasn't wildly punitive about it, no one wanted to be the one whose name was whispered behind market baskets. Your neighbours knew everything. Always. You couldn't sneeze near someone's garden without sparking a conversation about moral decay. But walk a little closer to the palace gates, and the story starts to change. Pharaohs, nobles, and the elite were playing by a whole different rule book. And that book had footnotes, and loopholes, and probably a secret chapter called concubines and convenient political marriages. For the ruling class, monogamy was more of a suggestion, a nice ideal for people without kingdoms to run. In reality, royal men often took multiple wives, and those wives didn't always have the luxury of saying no. Sometimes the additional partners were about politics, marrying the daughter of a rival nomarch to secure loyalty, or taking a foreign princess to show off the pharaoh's irresistible charm and vast diplomatic reach. Other times, well, pharaoh just wanted variety. Now, the head wife, also known as the Great Royal Wife, still held a privileged position. She wasn't just a romantic partner, she had political clout, religious roles, and often wielded real power. Nefertari, for instance, the beloved wife of Ramses II, was treated like a queen in every sense. Her tomb is one of the most beautiful in Egypt. Her name was carved beside his in temples. She wasn't just a wife, she was an icon. But even she shared her husband with other women. Ramses had many consorts, some of them quite young, and he had children with so many different women that historians have to colour-code them in family trees just to keep track. So was that kind of arrangement normal for everyone else? Not really. Outside the royal bubble, taking multiple wives, or even unofficial concubines, was far less common. It required resources. You had to be wealthy enough to support more than one household, provide for multiple children, and manage the drama that inevitably came with extra romantic entanglements. Most people could barely afford a single set of linens, let alone a whole second partner with their own amulet collection. And speaking of drama, yes, there was plenty. Even in monogamous households, suspicions of infidelity could lead to public disgrace, broken alliances, and the occasional curse hurled in the direction of a suspiciously friendly neighbour. And if someone was caught cheating, you wouldn't be dragged off to a dungeon, but you could find yourself divorced, shunned, or left out of the next festival invite list, which in Egyptian society was practically a death sentence for your social life. Now here's a fringe fact that doesn't come up often in history books. Egyptians believed that adultery could carry spiritual consequences, not just social ones. Some texts warned that a cheating spouse could be punished in the afterlife, made to suffer disfiguring torments or forced to walk upside down for eternity, which, aside from being deeply unsettling, also sounds extremely uncomfortable. Still, there's a scholarly debate simmering around all this. Were Egyptians truly monogamous in practice, or was that just the ideal? Archaeological records suggest that most people only lived with one partner at a time. But love poetry, gossip texts, and a few scandalous letters hint at more complex arrangements. Secret lovers, second households, and even trysts that took place during religious festivals. Some scholars argue that polyamory, or at least serial monogamy, may have been quietly practiced more than we think. Others maintain that the majority of Egyptians stuck to one partner, unless wealth or status made it otherwise feasible. Either way, it's clear that emotional exclusivity was something Egyptians valued. Whether or not it always happened is another story, but the ideal of loyal partnership shows up everywhere, from tomb art to literature. There's a beautiful passage in one love poem that reads, "My heart longs for her like bread for the oven, like a roof for the rain." That's not just lust, that's commitment, domestic, everyday, deeply rooted affection. So let's say you and your spouse are doing just fine. You're monogamous. You argue occasionally about who forgot to cover the jar of dates, but you've also started finishing each other's sentences and laughing at the same silly jokes. Life's good. But then you hear whispers. Someone in the next neighbourhood has taken a second woman into his house. She's younger, probably prettier, and definitely not great at keeping a low profile. They're hard talking her. A lot. Your spouse gives you that look. They don't even think about it look. You nod, loudly, and hand them the last piece of honeyed bread as a peace offering. Because for all the what-ifs and exceptions, you know this. Love, real love, isn't about how many people you can charm or how many kids you can father. It's about the person who knows you snore, who's seen you pick food out of your teeth with a reed, and still sits next to you during evening prayers. And in a world where the afterlife is measured in how you lived your life here, choosing loyalty isn't just wise, it's eternal. Now, just when you thought you had this whole ancient Egyptian marriage thing figured out, one spouse, one mud brick home, a shared clay pot of lentils, you find out about concubines. Yep, you're about to learn that even if monogamy was the norm for your average papyrus farmer or linen weaver, some households operated under the more, let's call it generously populated model of family life. Because in some cases, particularly in wealthier or elite homes, it wasn't just you and your spouse anymore. There was someone else, maybe more than one someone else. And that someone else might also be living under your roof. It usually started with a wealthy man, maybe a merchant, a local administrator, or a priest with a healthy temple salary. He had land, resources, social clout, enough to provide for a household with multiple adult women in it. One would be his wife, legally recognized. The others, concubines, sometimes called secondary wives or women of the house. These women weren't slaves. Important clarification, but they weren't exactly equal partners either. They existed in this strange in-between space, not mistresses, not servants, but something slightly more official than a side relationship and slightly less than a legal spouse. Now, depending on the arrangement, the primary wife might be fully aware and even accepting of the situation. After all, the status of the main wife often remained secure. She was the one with the title, the one whose name would appear on legal documents, who managed the home, oversaw food stores, and in many cases, raised the children of everyone in the household, including those born from concubines. Yeah, family dinners were probably interesting, but let's be honest. Not every household ran on peace and harmony. Jealousy, rivalry, and drama were inevitable. Imagine sharing your home with another woman who's also in love, or at least deeply entangled with your husband. She might be younger, prettier, or worse, better at baking date cakes. And now you're stuck under the same thatched roof, dodging eye contact and passive-aggressive fig offerings. Still, concubines had their place in the domestic hierarchy. They might cook, clean, care for children, or even weave and contribute economically to the household. In some wealthier homes, each woman had her own small room or section of the house. In others, they all shared common spaces, which could lead to anything from supportive sisterhood to petty squabbles over soap. And it wasn't just about sexual relationships. Concubines could become close allies, especially if they had children. Shared motherhood sometimes created unlikely bonds in a household that otherwise resembled the opening act of a romantic tragedy. Fringe fact: there are rare cases recorded where a wife, unable to bear children, encouraged her husband to take a concubine for the sake of offspring. In these instances, the second woman was chosen carefully, sometimes even from within the extended family, and her child would be raised by the primary wife as her own. This arrangement could bring peace, or make everyone silently hate each other until the end of time. As for the children of concubines, their status depended on the father's willingness to recognize them. If he did, they were legitimate heirs, full members of the household, and eligible to inherit property and continue the family line. If not, well, life got a lot harder. Some children ended up working as servants within their own father's home. Others were sent away to relatives or apprenticeships. But in many cases, especially when there were no other heirs, these children rose to prominence. It all came down to timing, luck, and how many people liked you when inheritance documents were being drawn up. And let's not forget the religious elite. Priests were technically supposed to be devoted to the gods above all else, but many of them also had wives, concubines, and an entire extended family tree branching off like the Nile Delta. In some temples, the priesthood became hereditary, passed down from father to son, regardless of which mother that son came from. You can imagine the temple office politics. Now here's where things get really messy. In homes with multiple women, power didn't just belong to the one with the title, it belonged to the one with the most influence. That could be the first wife, or it could be the concubine who bore the most sons, or the one who had the husband wrapped around her finger with just a look and a well-placed dab of lotus oil. Domestic dominance was constantly shifting, and with it came control over household decisions, servants, and even access to family resources. There's a famous legal case scratched onto papyrus from Deir el-Medina involving two women fighting over the right to a single storage room. Both lived in the same house, both had children by the same man, and both insisted that they had been promised control of the storeroom where all the grain and beer rations were kept. The scribe listening to their testimony probably had a headache the size of a pyramid, but eventually he ruled in favour of the woman with the more detailed witness account. Moral of the story? Never underestimate the power of keeping receipts, even in ancient Egypt. And here's the scholarly debate. How normalised were these multi-partner homes really? Were they social outliers, or were they quietly common among anyone with enough money and ambition? Some Egyptologists believe that the practice of keeping concubines was mostly confined to the elite, pharaohs, nobles, priests, while others argue that even middle-class households may have dabbled, especially when inheritance or lineage was at stake. The evidence is limited, and much of what we know comes from legal texts, tomb inscriptions, and the occasional scandalous letter that somehow survived 3,000 years of gossip erosion. So where does that leave you, dear listener? Let's say you're doing just fine with one partner, one kitchen, and one decent reed mat. And then one day, your neighbour shows up with a second woman, introduces her as just helping with the weaving, and suddenly everyone's eyebrows shoot up higher than a heron in mating season. Your spouse watches carefully, you smile too hard. Things get awkward. Because even if the gods, the law, and society technically allowed multiple partners, you know what matters most. The quiet agreement between you and the person who knows how you take your beer. Which song makes you smile and what that twitch in your eyebrow really means. In the end, it's not about how many people you can collect under one roof. It's about building a life that feels whole, even if it's just the two of you, side by side, dodging gossip and shared laundry duties like the domestic heroes you are. Let's say a few years go by. The roof's still holding up, you've figured out which corner of the house gets the best breeze, and somehow you and your partner have settled into a rhythm. The early flutters have matured into something deeper. Comfort, loyalty, the quiet kind of love that smells like bread and warm linen. But now it's time to talk paperwork. Or rather, the ancient Egyptian version of it, marriage contracts, which, spoiler alert, are about as romantic as a spreadsheet etched in stone. Now remember, technically you're already married. You moved in together, exchanged symbolic gifts, survived the first night, and have probably yelled about whose turn it is to patch the leaky water jug. So why draw up a contract now? Well, that's where things get interesting. Marriage contracts in ancient Egypt weren't required by the gods or the state. They were insurance. Legal backup for when love went sideways or someone conveniently forgot to mention they owned a small field outside of Memphis. These contracts were most common among the middle and upper classes. Scribes, merchants, property owners, anyone who had stuff worth protecting. The poor didn't bother, mostly because they didn't have enough assets to argue over. But if you had land, livestock, or a stash of fine linen that Auntie T.A. embroidered for your wedding, you wanted it all spelled out. Who gets what, who owes what, who gets kicked out if things go sour. You know, romance. So, what did these contracts actually say? In a nutshell, if we split, here's how we divide everything. And yes, there were often built-in penalties, especially to protect the wife. A typical clause might go something like, should the husband divorce his wife without cause, he shall pay her 2 debats of silver and return all her property, including the donkey and the combs, which is both extremely fair and oddly specific. One real contract from the Third Intermediate Period includes a line where the husband promises, I shall not raise a hand against her, or say a word to hurt her. Now that's lovely, until you realise it's there because someone definitely raised a hand and said a few words in previous marriages, and some scribe thought, you know what, we should put that in writing. Another contract lists the penalties for infidelity, at least from the wife's side. If she were caught cheating, she might be forced to forfeit her dowry, or even agree to be beaten with a rod. That's one of those moments where ancient Egypt shows its limits. Yes, women had more rights than in many ancient societies, but the system was still tilted. The husband's transgressions, often mentioned more vaguely, if at all. Patriarchy didn't exactly skip the Nile Valley. And now, a quirky little fringe fact. Some contracts ended with curses, actual curses. If either party broke the terms, they would invoke divine punishment. As in, may Thoth smite you, and may your body be food for the crocodiles. Which feels like a lot for forgetting to return a borrowed grinding stone, but hey, nothing motivates fidelity like the threat of becoming reptile chow. But there were moments of tenderness too. Some contracts include poetic language, little phrases of affection tucked between all the silver and grain tallies. She who pleases his heart, one man called his wife. He who walks with her under Ra's sun, another woman wrote. Even in legalese, love found a way to peek through the clauses. Now, the big scholarly debate around these contracts is whether they were strictly legal tools or had some social or religious significance. Some argue that by documenting the union, the couple elevated their status in the eyes of the community. Others say it was purely economic, a way to guard against future messes. There's no universal answer. Some couples never wrote one. Others treated them like gold. And not all contracts were bounced. Wealthy men could, and did, stack the terms in their favour. A scribe might promise his wife nothing more than continued affection, and retain all his property in the event of a split. In contrast, there are rare but powerful examples where the wife negotiated serious rights, control over shared property, sole guardianship of children, even the right to initiate divorce and keep the family cat. Okay, maybe not the cat, but we can dream. Speaking of divorce, these contracts often made the process smoother. If both parties agreed the relationship was done, the contract kicked in. No judges, no long trials, just a trip to the local scribe, who updated the household scrolls and probably offered a sympathetic shrug. Some breakups were peaceful, some messy, but the contract helped avoid public feuds, which, let's be honest, no one wanted during grain tax season. And here's how it might go down. You and your partner decide it's time to formalise things. Maybe you've had a child, or maybe you've just inherited a small orchard and suddenly need to think about asset protection. You visit a scribe, someone who smells faintly of ink and moral judgment. You sit on opposite sides of a palm frond mat while he writes, asking questions about dowries, property, what happens if one of you dies during flood season, and how many goats are too many goats to argue over. It's not romantic, but it's real. And when it's done, you both sign your names, well, your names written by the scribe, and seal the deal with a thumbprint or a small wax impression. It's not sexy, but it's deeply human. A shared acknowledgement that love is wonderful, but life is unpredictable. Later that evening, you both sit on the rooftop, legs dangling over the edge, a quiet wind brushing through the reeds. The sky is wide and golden. You glance at each other and laugh, not because the contract was emotional, but because it wasn't. And maybe that's the point. The poetry was in your first letter. The spark was in your first smile. The contract, that's just scaffolding. The frame that holds up everything you've built. So now you've got love and legal protection. You're not just sharing food and chores anymore. You're sharing terms, agreements, and silent promises that stretch beyond moonlight and perfume cones. And if that's not commitment, what is? So picture this. The sun's just risen, the donkey is already yelling, and your spouse is muttering about someone leaving the grain jar open again. There's a child crying next door, a neighbour's goat has wandered into your courtyard for the third time this week, and you're elbow deep in date syrup. This is married life in ancient Egypt, not dramatic, not poetic, just everyday sun-baked normalcy. And then one day it hits you. It's not working anymore. The jokes have stopped landing. The mat feels colder at night. That honey jar from the market, the one that started everything, sits empty on the shelf, dusty and forgotten. You're thinking about a word now, divorce. And in ancient Egypt it's surprisingly chill. No courts, no 7-hour hearings, no smug lawyer in a linen kilt charging you a sack of wheat just to argue about who gets the bed mat. Divorce in this society isn't taboo, it's just life. Sometimes people don't work out. Maybe it's irreconcilable differences. Maybe it's because they keep talking during temple hymns. Or maybe it's that they told everyone at the market you snore like a hippo. Regardless of the reason, you don't have to stay. And that for a culture 3,000 years ago is kind of remarkable. Ending a marriage could be initiated by either party. That's right, either. Not just the man. Women could file for divorce too. All they had to do was say, I'm leaving, and go back to their family. Or start fresh somewhere else. If there was a marriage contract, and hopefully there was, It would spell out what each party got to take with them. She usually kept her dowry. He might keep the donkey. No one got the mutual friends. And let's be honest, Egyptians didn't romanticize suffering. If you were unhappy, you were allowed to leave. No divine punishment. No eternal shame. No soul-rotting guilt trip baked into temple hymns. There was even a word for it. Refusal of cohabitation. It's not exactly conscious uncoupling, but it gets the point across. Here's how it might look in practice. You've had enough. You and your spouse haven't exchanged more than 6 words all week, and one of those words was beetles. You pack your belongings, a comb, a necklace, your share of the grain, and go to a family member's home or maybe at your own place if you're independent enough. There's no shouting match, no drama-filled public scene. You might leave a note. You might send word through a cousin. You might walk away silently, your sandals thumping against the dirt like punctuation marks. And that's it. You're no longer married. Now, children complicate things, always do. If there were kids involved, decisions had to be made. Sometimes children stayed with the mother, especially if they were very young. Sometimes older kids went with the father, especially sons, who might be groomed to take on trades or positions. In some cases, the couple worked out shared arrangements. Ancient Egypt wasn't big on joint custody as a legal term, but the flexibility was there, and people adapted. Fringe detail incoming. There's at least one papyrus scroll that tells of a woman not only divorcing her husband, but demanding the return of a bronze mirror she'd brought into the marriage. She claimed he used it carelessly, which sounds petty until you realise it probably cost more than his entire fishing gear collection. Even 3 millennia ago, people were fighting over who ruined the good stuff. There's also an account from Deir el Medina where a woman left her husband for being cruel, and the community backed her. She took her things, moved in with her brother, and resumed her work as a weaver. No legal proceedings, just personal agency. There was no need to get a temple's blessing or a god's permission. Egypt's view on divorce was pragmatic. Life is unpredictable, people change, and love sometimes sours like goat milk in the sun. That said, there were consequences. Social ones. Depending on the reason for the split, one party might be gossiped about, excluded from gatherings, or given the cold shoulder at festivals. If a woman left a kind, generous husband for someone new, tongues wagged. If a man abandoned his wife and children to chase a younger woman who smelled like lotus oil and trouble, people judged. Softly, but they judged. It was a small, chatty world, and reputation mattered. And then there's the scholarly debate. Were divorces truly equal in practice, or did men still hold more social power when things fell apart? Some argue that while women had the right to leave, they often depended on family support to do so, making the decision riskier. Others point to numerous documents showing women not only initiating divorce, but doing so with confidence and community backing. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the sandy middle. Another interesting twist. Remarriage was common. Like, really common. A divorced woman might be courted again within weeks. A man who found himself single didn't exactly sit around writing sad poetry under the moonlight. Egypt wasn't obsessed with purity or lifelong unions. Love was fluid. People wanted companionship, stability, a good laugh over shared lentils. And if one partnership didn't work out, they'd try again. This flexible, somewhat progressive view of divorce stands in sharp contrast to the rigidity found in later societies. There was no religious stigma, no "till death do us part" etched in stone. Just people doing their best, adjusting, and sometimes walking away with a handful of linen, half a jug of oil, and their dignity mostly intact. Imagine you're back in your small house, now quiet, your partner gone, your belongings sorted. You light a lamp, open a window, and sit with the silence. It's not loneliness, not entirely. It's space, clarity, a chance to start again. Maybe tomorrow you'll visit the market, or maybe you'll run into an old friend. Maybe you'll catch a familiar scent and remember what it's like to smile without forcing it. In Egypt, the end of love wasn't the end of life. It was just another bend in the Nile. So let's say the opposite happens. Things don't fall apart. You stick it out. The honey never stops tasting sweet. Your partner still laughs at your jokes about stubborn donkeys. And somehow you've gotten good at coexisting in a house where you can't move without brushing elbows. And then it happens. The moment you've been half expecting, half dreading, and definitely not prepared for. A tiny, squirming bundle wrapped in cloth and screaming like they have just been told there's no more beer. Congratulations, you're a parent now. Welcome to the world of kids' inheritance and tiny wigs, because yes, even children in ancient Egypt had elaborate hairstyles. Raising children in this world is no small feat. It starts from day one, when your household gets just a little louder, a little messier, and your sleep schedule is sacrificed to the gods of infancy. Babies are swaddled tightly and often carried around in slings while you try to keep up with chores. Cribs, not a thing. The baby usually sleeps on a mat beside you, or, let's be honest, on you until they're old enough to roll over and steal your pillow. Children are blessings, of course. Emotional ones, spiritual ones, and, let's be real, economic ones too. In a society where family labour is the foundation of survival, having more hands to help means more security. So from a young age, kids are put to work in small ways, gathering firewood, fetching water, shooing chickens out of the courtyard. They're not burdened, they're involved. Life isn't split into neat stages like ours. Childhood blends into adulthood with a smooth, sandy transition. You grow up while grinding grain or following your older sibling to the fields. And how do you show off your child? You style their hair, obviously. Boys and girls alike often wear the senlock of youth, a shaved head with one long curled lock dangling over the side. It's adorable and also symbolic. It tells the world this child is still growing, still learning, still protected by the gods of childhood. Once they come of age, usually around puberty, the sidelock goes, and with it, the final traces of babyhood. Education is a luxury, not a right. If you're part of the elite, your child might study at the temple schools, learning to read, write, do math, and recite hymns while being scolded by the elderly scribes who smell like ink and papyrus dust. If you're from a more modest household, education is practical. Boys learn their father's trade. Girls learn to manage the home, weave, cook, and, in some cases, run small businesses. The idea isn't about climbing some career ladder, it's about continuity, passing on skills, preserving the rhythm of life, and here's where things get legacy-focused. Because as soon as a child is born, you're not just raising them, you're thinking about what they'll inherit. Property, tools, livestock, maybe even a modest garden near the riverbank. Ancient Egyptians were obsessed with lineage. The idea of name preservation was crucial. If your name isn't spoken in the afterlife, your soul could wither. So having children wasn't just cute, it were cosmic insurance. They would mourn you properly, offer food at your tomb, speak your name, and keep you spiritually alive forever. No pressure, kids. Inheritance laws were surprisingly fair. Property could pass to sons and daughters. That's right, girls weren't excluded from inheritance just because of their gender. In fact, many women inherited houses, land, and business rights. Sometimes a daughter even became the family's main heir if no son survived, or if she was particularly trusted. In those cases, her husband might move into her household and manage the property under her name. In other words, if you raised a smart, capable daughter, she could carry your legacy just fine. But here's the fringe detail. Some children were written into inheritance documents before they were even born. Expectant parents would draft clauses like, "To the child currently within my wife's womb, I leave half my cattle." It's oddly touching and deeply practical. It meant your child had legal protection the moment they emerged squawking into the world. And if they didn't survive, well, the contract included backup instructions. Cold? Maybe. But in a society where infant mortality was heartbreakingly common, planning wasn't heartless. It was necessary. Let's talk about the emotional side, though. Parenting in ancient Egypt wasn't just practical, it was tender. We find letters from fathers to children that radiate pride and affection. Art that shows mothers cradling babies, toddlers clinging to their father's legs. Even tomb inscriptions speak to the bond between parent and child. One father writes of his daughter, "She filled my house with light. She was as bread to my hunger." That's not just survival, that's deep personal love. Still, as the children grow, so does the tension. What happens when there's more than one child, and more than one inheritance stake? Here's where the sibling squabbles take a turn for the political. In wealthier families, each child might receive a share of property or tools, but disputes happened, especially when second wives or concubines were involved. Which child gets what? Are all the children equal? Did dad make a secret agreement with one of the older sons? And just how official was that bit of papyrus someone keeps waving around? To avoid drama, some parents divided assets while still alive. They would host what was essentially a family meeting, doling out land, animals, and business shares like a live-action will reading. Other times, parents waited until the death and left it all to be figured out through scribal arbitration, sibling persuasion, or, on occasion, full-blown bickering that lasted years. Egyptian legal documents are full of inheritance disputes, many of them hilariously petty and deeply human. There's a case of two brothers fighting over a single mule and half a fig tree. Another features a daughter accusing her half-brother of forging a will, complete with witnesses who remember it differently. One judge even wrote in the margin of a scroll, "Let them settle this in the street if they must." That's bureaucratic burnout, ancient style. And this leads to the academic question. Were inheritance practices truly equitable, or were daughters still quietly sidelined in favour of sons? Records show both. While the law favoured fairness, culture sometimes bent the rules. A father's affection, a mother's favour, or even a priest's influence could tip the scales. But at least on paper, every child had a shot. So now it's your turn. You're older, wiser, a little greyer under your linen cap. You look at your children, messy, loud, occasionally disobedient, and you start to write it all down. Who gets the donkey? Who gets the jars? Who gets the house, the courtyard fig tree, and the rights to your grandfather's good luck charm? You don't have much, but you want it to count. And at the bottom of the scroll you add a line that isn't legally required. To all my children, I leave my name, and the hope that they will speak it with kindness. Because in the end, inheritance isn't just about stuff. It's about memory, and you want to be remembered well. Picture yourself back in the soft hush of early morning. The market's not open yet, the bread ovens are just starting to glow, and a distant rooster is already working overtime. You're making your way down a dusty side path, not for errands or chores, but because you've got that unmistakable feeling again. Fluttery, foolish, maybe a little dangerous. This time, though, you're not the one being pursued. You're the one doing the chasing, because tonight we're stepping into the sandals of the bold, brilliant women who made the first move. Forget the passive courtship models of later cultures. In ancient Egypt, women weren't just sitting around waiting to be noticed. If a woman liked someone, she had schools, she had charm, she had poetry, and she wasn't afraid to use them. The assumption that all ancient love was male-driven? Toss it into the Nile. The real story's far more nuanced, and frankly, more fun. Take the love poems preserved from the Ramesside period. Many are written from the female perspective. The speaker is direct, sometimes playful, and definitely not shy. She talks about wanting to see her lover, touch him, kiss him, she sneaks out to find him, she sets the terms. One particularly daring verse reads, "I will go and stand outside his house, and if his mother sees me, I'll say I'm fetching water." That's either the most ancient pickup line or a romantic espionage plan with bonus hydration. Either way, the intent is clear. She's taking charge. So how would an ancient Egyptian woman initiate a relationship? For starters, perfume. Nothing subtle about it. She'd make herself a walking lotus-scented love spell. These oils weren't just for smell, they were seductive. A dab behind the ears, across the collarbone, on the wrists. Step 1, smell amazing. Step 2, make eye contact and wait a breath too long before looking away. Step 3, ask for help lifting something heavy even if it's not classic. She might accidentally pass by the man's workshop multiple times a day. She might send him a little token, an amulet, a flower, or if she was feeling especially flirty, a small comb. Not because his hair was a disaster, although maybe it was, but because grooming was intimate. To offer a comb was to say, "I want to touch you, or at least watch you fix your hair while I admire the results." There's even evidence that women would write the first love letters, or, more realistically, dictate them to scribes since full literacy wasn't universal. But don't underestimate the power of a woman leaning over a scribe's shoulder, choosing every word carefully while pretending not to smile. "Tell him he's like beer after a long fast," she'd say. Or, "Tell him my heart beats like festival drums when I see him." And the scribe, trying not to roll his eyes, would oblige, possibly adding a bit of flair, because even scribes loved drama. This boldness extended into spiritual realms too. Women might make offerings to Hathor, the goddess of love, beauty and joy, asking her to soften a man's heart. Or they'd leave a flower at a small shrine with a whispered wish, like a prayer wrapped in petals. Love wasn't just chemistry, it was strategy supported by divine forces and carefully honed charm. Fringe fact? In some love spells, yes, love spells, women were the casters. Papyrus scrolls from Thebes describe incantations designed to draw a man's desire, with ingredients that include honey, beer, crocodile fat, of course, and sometimes the ashes of a snake. You know, just your standard romantic toolkit. While some of these were likely used with serious intent, others may have been ritual performances, full of symbolism and dramatic flair. Either way, the idea of a woman taking magical control over her love life is both empowering and a little terrifying. Now, some scholars debate how widespread this agency really was. Was it only elite women who had this kind of freedom? Were rural women just as bold? Or did class limit that kind of autonomy? The records are skewed toward the literate, the wealthy, and the ones who had tomb walls to etch their stories onto. But based on the poetic texts, the iconography, and a few juicy legal documents involving very assertive women, it's safe to say that female initiative wasn't rare. It was respected, desired even. Consider this. In a love poem, a male speaker praises the woman not just for her beauty, but her confidence. She walks past the soldiers and their eyes are unsteady. She speaks and all hearts are turned. That's not a damsel in distress. That's someone who knows her effect and uses it well. Egyptian masculinity, at least in romantic literature, often admired strength and boldness in a partner. A love story where both people had a voice wasn't an exception, it was the ideal. Let's imagine you're that woman. You've had your eye on someone, maybe a potter or a junior temple guard who looks entirely too good in linen. You've watched him haul clay for weeks, waited for the right moment. Now it's festival day, and you walk by in your best wrap, hair curled, jewellery clinking just enough to announce your arrival, without seeming like you care. You stop. You smile. You hand him a pomegranate and say, "It reminded me of your lips." Then you walk away like it's no big deal. And just like that, you've shifted the story. You're not the one being chased. You're the one who makes the first move. The one who starts the poem instead of waiting to be written into it. It might not work. He might fumble his words, blush, or panic and pretend he doesn't like fruit. But you've already won, because you dared. Back at home, maybe you light a little lamp at Hathor's shrine. Tuck a strand of papyrus with your favourite verse under your mat, and smile. You've sent your message. The rest is in the god's hands. Or his. And maybe, just maybe, he shows up tomorrow with a fig. You knew it was risky from the moment they looked at you. Not a glance, not a passing smile, but that long wordless gaze across the courtyard, the kind that says, "You shouldn't be talking to me, but here we are." You knew the rules, everyone in Egypt did. Stick to your caste, marry your own kind, don't disrupt the carefully carved social order. But tonight, you're tangled in something ancient, electric, and completely forbidden. Because this isn't just any love story. This is a love that crosses the lines, one of caste, of status, and of every warning your mother ever whispered. In ancient Egypt, society wasn't a strict caste system in the way of some later cultures, but it was still layered, like a massive date cake with priests and nobles at the top, scribes and craftsmen in the middle, and farmers, servants, and labourers holding everything up from below. You could climb the social ladder, yes, but not easily. And marrying someone from a different class? That was a move bold enough to make the neighbours drop their water jugs in shock. Let's say you're a scribe, educated, respected, not rich exactly, but stable. You spend your days copying temple scrolls, managing records, and occasionally writing love poems on the side. Then one day you meet her. She's a fishnet maker, barefoot, quick-witted, with calloused hands and a laugh that breaks like sunlight across water. She sells nets by the river, banters with fishermen, and smells faintly of smoked tilapia and warm river mud. You're smitten, but she's not from your world. You write with ink, she knots rope with her teeth. Your friends tease you, your colleagues raise eyebrows. You could marry a merchant's daughter, someone says, a baker's niece at least. But none of them make you forget your place in the middle of a sentence like she does. These are the kinds of love stories that get whispered about, and sometimes recorded obliquely, subtly, in scraps of poetry and tucked away legal documents. While most marriages stayed within social boundaries, there were always exceptions. The servant who fell for a noble's daughter, the temple musician who ran off with a potter, the royal guard who married a laundress and refused to care what anyone said about it. Still, it wasn't easy. Class wasn't enforced by law but by expectation, and those expectations ran deep. Marrying beneath you could mean losing status, respect, or even your job. A priest, for example, was expected to marry someone with spiritual training or noble blood. If he chose a tavern girl instead, the temple might reassign him somewhere remote, say the far end of the crocodile-infested marshlands. And for the women, the risk was often greater. A noble woman seen consorting with someone unworthy could lose inheritance rights, damage her family's standing, and, if she wasn't careful, be exiled to live with distant relatives in an even dustier village with even more goats. And yet, it still happened. Because when two people are drawn together, even the gods tend to look the other way now and then. For an fringe fact, there's an old tale, part myth, part court gossip, that tells of a highborn woman who fell for a boatman. She'd sneak out at night, wrapped in linen cloaks, and meet him near the edge of the Nile, where the reeds grew tall and whispered their secrets. When she was discovered, she claimed the goddess Hathor had sent her a vision. The man you scorn is the one who carries your heart. It didn't save her from disgrace, but it did make for one of the most retold love stories in the region. You still hear the boatman's lullaby sung during festivals. Now, scholars go back and forth on just how common these cross-status romances really were. The majority of surviving marriage contracts are between people of similar standing. That's logical, status was survival. But those stories on the edges, the ones that didn't fit the mould, they tell us that love didn't always care about hieroglyphs on a family seal or the price of a donkey herd. The heart went where it wanted. And sometimes that meant choosing scandal over safety. Let's say your relationship progresses in secret. You meet at the far end of the market, you exchange gifts, she brings you a lucky fish scale, you give her a carved pen case. Every glance is a risk, every brush of the hand feels like a prayer. You wonder how long you can keep this up before someone talks. You wonder if you should walk away, but then one day she surprises you. She comes to your home in daylight, barefaced and calm. "I'm tired of being a secret," she says. "I don't want to be a poem. I want to be your partner." And something in you shifts. You realise that no one's going to grant you permission. There's no decree from the gods, no friendly neighbour suddenly blessing your union. It's on you. And so slowly, you start making it real. You speak her name in public, you take her to the market with you, you bring her into your world and let her bring you into hers. There are challenges. Your old friends drift away. Her family is wary, but over time people adapt, because Egypt is many things, old, sacred, stubborn, but also deeply practical. If the fishnet maker and the scribe can build a stable household, raise good children and share their beer rations fairly, then maybe status doesn't matter as much as it used to. You won't find your story carved into tomb walls or written in golden ink on temple ceilings, but it lives in the corners of old papyri, in the lines of anonymous poems, in the shared space between two lives that shouldn't have met, but did. And every now and then, when someone sees you together, laughing over figs, arguing about sandals, they might shake their head and mutter, "Well, I didn't expect that." But deep down, they're smiling. Because everyone, even in ancient Egypt, loves a good underdog love story. You never really think about it when you're young and in love, what happens after. After the poems, after the honey jars and late-night laughter, after the kids, the disputes, the reconciliation over lentils and apologies made with gifts wrapped in linen. But in ancient Egypt, you're not just planning for this life. You're planning for the next one by two. Love doesn't end with death here. It just relocates. Tonight, we're descending into the limestone silence of eternity, where you and your partner lie side by side forever. Because in this world, your relationship isn't complete without the afterlife clause. Death isn't an ending in Egypt. It's a transition, a continuation. You don't just die, you travel. Your body is wrapped, your name is preserved, and your soul takes a journey through the underworld, hopefully avoiding all the spiky, demon-filled parts. But here's the catch. If you're married, you don't plan for that voyage alone. No, you plan it as a couple. From the moment you've got enough silver saved, or, let's be honest, the moment you inherit a spare plot of desert, you start thinking about your tomb, your final home, a place not just to rest, but to host your soul in style. And if things have gone well in your marriage, there's no question. Your spouse is joining you in that eternal lease, side by side, forever, like literally forever. No breaks, no, "I need some space," just you, them, and a carefully painted ceiling showing a field of reeds. Tomb inscriptions reflect this. Husbands and wives are often depicted sitting together, smiling like they just heard a good joke. They are shown receiving offerings, holding hands, or even sniffing a lotus flower together, because nothing says romance like eternal botany. The message is clear. We loved in life, we'll love in death, and if we don't get enough food offerings, we're haunting our descendants. And don't forget the stayus. Couples were often carved into stone, sitting side by side with serene expressions, like they've finally figured out how to sleep through each other's snoring. These statues weren't decorative. They were spiritual vessels, giving your soul a place to inhabit if your mummy body got damaged. So choosing to be sculpted with your partner was the ultimate declaration of trust. If I have to share a stone body for eternity, I choose you. This leads us to one of the most intimate details of Egyptian love culture: the letters to the dead. These were real things, papyrus notes or pottery shards left in tombs, often from grieving spouses, asking the deceased for guidance, forgiveness, or comfort. One famous letter, written by a widow to her late husband, begs him to stop haunting her dreams. He's angry, she says, because she remarried too quickly. She defends herself gently, saying she needed protection and love. The letter ends with a plea: "Be kind to me in the night. Let me sleep in peace." Tell me that's not heartbreakingly human. Of course, not every afterlife marriage was peaceful. Some people deliberately chose not to be buried with their spouse. A man might build his tomb with a slot left empty, either because he never remarried after a divorce, or because he didn't trust his widow not to mess things up. And if a spouse had passed away and remarried, decisions had to be made. Who gets the final tomb? Is it the first love? The most recent? Whoever paid for the limestone? This raises a fringe issue that scholars are still whispering about: posthumous jealous. There's evidence, spotty but real, that some tombs were edited by later spouses. In one case, a wife's name was chiselled off a shared tomb wall after her husband married someone new. The new wife's name was added in. Ancient Egypt may be full of grand spiritual ideals, but let's not pretend people didn't still squabble over who got to lie next to whom for eternity. There's also the matter of how your tomb was decorated. Couples might choose scenes from their life together, harvesting grain, sailing, enjoying festivals. These images weren't just memories, they were instructions for the afterlife. We want to do this again, just like this. So if your tomb shows you and your partner reclining on a couch with cups of wine and a musician strumming a harp, it's because you plan to repeat that exact scene for eternity, the ultimate date night, forever. But here's where it gets really interesting. Some people planned for multiple options. A man might commission more than one tomb statue, one with his first wife, another with his second, which raises the question: are they all hanging out together in the afterlife? Is there a ghostly dinner party happening somewhere beyond the veil, full of awkward small talk and subtle shade? Scholars debate this endlessly. Was the afterlife inclusive? Or did each soul get their own curated reality, filtered like a social media feed so no one had to see their ex? And then there's the legal aspect. Some marriage contracts included clauses about burial. She shall be buried beside him. He shall not deny her rights in death. These weren't just logistics, they were their promises, binding vows that stretched beyond the river of life and into the field of reeds. Refusing someone burial rights could curse their soul. Granting them those rights was a final act of devotion. There's even one recorded case where a widow demanded her late husband's family return his body so she could bury him properly. They'd tried to claim him for a tomb near their estate. She fought them, and won. Love doesn't get more hardcore than tomb custody battles. So imagine you and your partner sitting in your modest home sipping date beer, talking about death like it's just another errand to run. You discuss tomb placement, ideal wall scenes, and what kind of food offerings you want. You both agree on bread, beer, and maybe roasted goose if the kids really love you. Then you take a moment, just a quiet one, to appreciate the strangeness of it all. That even in death you're not alone. That the same person who knew how to tease you with one eyebrow and always stole your better pillow will lie beside you, wrapped in linen, your names carved in stone, your love sealed in silence. And maybe, just maybe, when your souls awaken in the cool morning mist of the afterlife, you'll find each other again, hand in hand, hearts light, ready to begin forever. You're walking through the palace now, not yours, obviously, but the pharaoh's. Sunlight streams through massive columns painted in blue and gold, reflecting off polished floors where guards stand still as statues. Incense curls from brass burners, and everything smells like wealth, power. and a tiny bit of overconfidence. You're here not for politics or ceremony, but to peek into the drama of royal relationships. Because while everyday Egyptians built marriages on affection, chores and shared lentils, the royal family built theirs on power, bloodlines, and the occasional surprise you're marrying your sister moment. Welcome to Royal Love, Royal Problems. Let's start with the basics. Pharaoh wasn't just king, he was divine, the living god Horus in human form, which meant his marriage wasn't just about companionship, it was the part of the cosmic order. When the pharaoh married, he wasn't just choosing a wife, he was reenacting divine unity. Every royal union echoed the mythical marriage of Isis and Osiris, Nut and Geb, or Hathor and Ra, which sounds romantic until you remember some of those gods were siblings. Yeah, let's talk about that. In many dynasties, pharaohs married their sisters or half-sisters, not out of a weird preference, but to keep the bloodline pure, divine, unbroken, straight from the gods. If your father is a god and your mother is a goddess, who else are you supposed to marry? A fishmonger's daughter? Please, that's not how dynasties roll. Take Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Technically, we're not sure if they were related, but some historians believe Nefertiti may have been his cousin or half-sister. And if she wasn't, no problem. He just married other relatives on the side, including, possibly, one of his daughters. Yes, it gets weird. And even though the archaeological record is patchy, the overall picture is clear. Keeping it in the family was a recurring theme in royal romance, but it wasn't all genetics and political math. Some pharaohs genuinely loved their wives. Ramses II famously adored Nefertari, and the inscriptions in her tomb practically glow with praise. For her the sun rises, he writes. For her the gods rejoice. He might have had other wives, lots of them actually, but Nefertari was the queen of his heart, so much so that he built her a spectacular tomb in the Valley of the Queens, filled with vivid images of her standing confidently beside the gods, not behind, beside. Still, royal love was complicated. Every marriage had a strategic layer. A union with a foreign princess might solidify an alliance with a neighbouring kingdom. That meant your wife might arrive from Babylon or Nubia speaking a different language, bringing her own servants, customs, and possibly an elephant or two. She'd be placed in the harem, not always a prison, more like a gilded dormitory for royal wives and concubines. She might never see her homeland again. Her job? Produce a male heir. Look regal, don't insult the chief queen. And the harem was not all peacock feathers and scented baths. It could be intensely political. Wives and their supporters jockeyed for influence, hoping to push their sons higher up the succession ladder. There are entire papyri that read like royal soap operas. One wife poisons another, a rival prince mysteriously vanishes, someone bribes a priest, and suddenly a miracle declares the next pharaoh. If Netflix ever runs out of royal dramas, ancient Egypt is sitting here dusty and ready. Fringe fact? Pharaohs sometimes named their wives as co-rulers. In these rare but fascinating cases, the queen took on kingly titles and ruled jointly, sometimes even dressing in male regalia, including the ceremonial beard. Hatshepsut, for example, didn't just marry power, she became it. Her love life is still a mystery, but her political savvy, legendary. And then there's the artistic record. In royal tombs and temples, pharaohs are often shown with their queens in surprisingly tender scenes, holding hands, embracing, sharing a banquet. While these could be symbolic, they hint at emotional intimacy not typically found in other state propaganda. The affection is there, carved into stone, preserved beneath centuries of sand and silence. Still, scholarly debate swirls like desert wind. Were royal marriages emotional or purely functional? Were sibling unions genuinely accepted, or was that just elite propaganda? And did the pharaohs love? Or did they merely perform love for the benefit of priests and politics? Hard to say. The truth likely varies by ruler, by era, and by which god was trending at the time. So let's imagine you're a royal bride. You've just been selected to marry the pharaoh. Maybe you're a noble's daughter, maybe a foreign princess sent in a diplomatic trade like a really stressed out gift basket. You arrive at the palace with eyes wide, stomach in knots. You're dressed in the finest linen, hair braided with gold thread, fingers heavy with amulets. You're introduced to your husband, tall painted eyeliner, smells like myrrh and ego. You try not to stare, you try not to trip. He smiles. He says something about the gods bringing you to him. You nod. You're not sure whether to bow or hug him. You settle on standing very still. Later, you're shown your chambers. The walls are painted with scenes of lotuses and falcons. A servant pours you pomegranate wine, and you sit there alone wondering what comes next. If he'll care, if he'll call you, if you're just another petal on his bouquet of brides. But maybe he does care. Maybe he visits often. Maybe he asks about your home, your dreams, your favourite music. Maybe, despite all the politics and pressure, something real blooms. And maybe, years later, your name is carved into the limestone beside his. Not as a footnote, not as an ornament, but as a partner. As someone who, even in a palace crowded with golden gods, managed to be seen. Because even pharaohs need someone to come home to. So far we've talked about people, scribes, fishnet makers, jealous concubines, and politically entangled queens. But if you want to truly understand love in ancient Egypt, you have to look above them all. Up into the realm of shining eyes, golden boats, and very dramatic family arguments. Because the blueprint for Egyptian romance wasn't just written in ink, it was etched in myth. Tonight, we're cracking open the divine soap opera that is The Love Lives of the Gods, where nothing is ever simple, everyone is related, and jealousy occasionally involves full-body resurrection. Let's start with the original power couple, Isis and Osiris. If you've ever wondered what eternal devotion looks like, these two have you covered. Osiris, the wise and just ruler of Egypt, is murdered by his jealous brother Set, who, for reasons known only to the most deranged villains, chops him into pieces and scatters them across the land. Isis, his wife and sister, because, yes, Egyptian divine families have the family tree of a pretzel, goes full grief mode and travels across Egypt collecting each and every piece. All of them, including the, anatomically delicate parts. When she finds all of him, she reassembles his body, uses magic to bring him back to life just long enough to conceive their son, Horus, and then mourns him all over again when he slips permanently into the afterlife. Romantic? Definitely. A little creepy? Sure. But the loyalty? Legendary. Isis isn't just a goddess, she's the patron saint of till death do us part, and then I'll still hunt your soul down across dimensions. This myth wasn't just a story for temple priests and curious children. It was the model of love itself, enduring, loyal, powerful enough to fight death. When couples married, they sometimes referenced Isis and Osiris in vows or private prayers, and when they buried each other, they often included amulets of these deities, hoping to emulate their devotion in the afterlife. You might not be able to fly across the desert in falcon form to resemble your spouse's spiritual essence, but the intention counted. Now let's talk about Isis and Osiris' son, Horus, the falcon-headed god of kingship and sky. Horus doesn't get much romance time. He's too busy fighting Set in a divine custody battle for Egypt that makes modern legal drama look tame. But his existence is itself a testament to love. Born from a union steeped in tragedy and triumph, Horus becomes a symbol of legacy, justice, and the continuation of love after loss. Which brings us to Set, the original villain of the Egyptian pantheon. He's chaos, storm, disorder, and definitely not invited to romantic festivals. Set's love life is less well documented, but one thing is clear. Wherever he goes, relationships get messy. Some versions of the Horus versus Set myth include episodes of attempted seduction, domination, and a truly awkward scene involving lettuce that scholars still debate with increasingly furrowed brows. Suffice to say, Set represents the darker side of desire. Jealousy, betrayal, and the drive to possess, rather than love. Then there's Nut and Geb, sky and earth. Quite literally the mother and father of all things. Their love is cosmic. Nut, the sky, arches over Geb, the earth, creating the world's structure. Their bond is so intense that the sun god Ra has to forcibly separate them to make room for time and space. In Tomb art, Nut is often shown stretching across the sky, covered in stars, while Geb lies beneath her, reaching up. They're lovers, yes, but also the reason anything exists at all. Love as a force of creation, take that poetry. Of course, not every divine romance is noble and poetic. The gods of Egypt had love lives full of squabbles, competition, and very public dysfunction. Hathor, goddess of love, beauty, music, and intoxication, had flings with several major deities, most notably Ra. In one version of the myth, she literally has to seduce Ra to get him to stop being cranky and unleash his healing powers. In another, she gets so drunk and happy during a festival that she saves humanity from destruction just by dancing. Hathor isn't ashamed of her pleasures. She's sensual, bold, flirtatious, everything a goddess of love should be. She teaches that desire isn't shameful, it's joyful. And her festivals? Wild. Think rivers of beer, music, food, and a lot of blurred memories. Couples would make offerings to Hathor to spice up their love life or ensure a happy marriage. And sometimes they'd blame her when they made less than wise romantic decisions. Why did I go back to him again? Hathor, probably. Then there's Sekhmet, lioness-headed goddess of war and destruction, who somehow is also connected to love. How? Because in one myth she's the wrathful form of Hathor, transformed into a violent avenger when Ra wants to punish humanity. She drinks blood, burns cities, and generally makes Set look like a naughty puppy. But eventually she's pacified with red beer, disguised as blood, gets hammered, and returns to her gentler form. Ancient lesson: even the fiercest rage can be soothed by a good drink and the right company. Now here's a fringe fact for you. The gods sometimes cross gender lines. In certain myths, gods transform, blend, or shift their roles depending on the story. There are hints at dual-gendered deities, and even a tale or two of male gods giving birth after swallowing another god or merging with them. The idea of rigid gender roles? Not quite so rigid when your gods can turn into animals, combine with the sun and fly through the underworld at night. All of this, the passion, the betrayal, the resurrection, the divine dance, filtered down into mortal lives. When Egyptians loved, they didn't just fall for someone's smile or status. They saw echoes of the gods, the healing of Isis, the longing of Geb, the joy of Hathor, the chaos of Set. Every relationship, in its own messy way, participated in the great divine rhythm. So next time you look across the courtyard and feel your stomach flutter, remember, you're not just crushing on a cute artisan. You're reenacting an ancient dance that began in the stars. Whether your love story ends in bliss, heartbreak, or a complicated afterlife clause involving two statues and a field of reeds, you're part of something cosmic. Because in Egypt, love wasn't just human, it was divine. It's late now. The stars have come out, twinkling over the palms like tiny fragments of crushed faience, and the wind hums softly through the reeds along the Nile. Inside your home, the oil lamp burns low, casting a warm flicker on the wall. You're lying on your mat, and something's been bothering you. An itch at the back of your mind. It's not about love or marriage, not exactly. It's about fear. The small, quiet fear that someone might take your happiness away. Because in ancient Egypt, when love bloomed too brightly, people got nervous. That's when they turned to witchcraft and love spells, the magical safety net for anxious hearts and suspicious minds. Now magic, or hika, as the Egyptians called it, wasn't some back-alley taboo. It was a recognised force, part of the natural and spiritual world. Everyone believed in it. Priests practiced it, doctors used it, farmers sprinkled it around their fields, and lovers? Oh, lovers were some of its most loyal customers. Because when your heart's on the line and you're terrified of losing someone, logic takes a back seat and suddenly you're grinding crocodile skin into a paste while muttering an incantation at midnight. You know, just in case. Let's say you're madly in love, but the person you adore doesn't seem to feel the same way. Maybe they're polite, maybe they're nice, but there's no spark. You've tried poems, you've tried figs, you've even walked past them with a subtle limp just to see if they'd ask if you were okay. Nothing. So what do? You go to the wise woman. Every village had one. She might be a midwife, a healer, or someone's very creepy aunt who lives on the edge of town surrounded by cats. You bring her an offering, beer, bread, a small bundle of herbs, and tell her your problem. She nods knowingly. She's heard this 1,000 times before, and then she gives you something, a potion, a spell, a charm wrapped in linen. Maybe a wax figurine to bury near the person's doorway. Maybe a love potion to sneak into their beer. But just a drop, she warns. More than that, and they'll be yours forever, and that gets exhausting. Fringe fact: one preserved spell calls for the ashes of a burned raven mixed with honey, and recited over 7 lotus petals. Another uses a beetle, mashed and shaped into a heart, to be tucked under the beloved's sleeping mat. It sounds intense, but ancient Egyptians believed deeply in the symbolism of materials. Beetles were renewal, honey was sweetness and allure. Ravens? Well, ravens were just creepy, and that's the vibe you're going for when casting spells after dark. But love magic wasn't always about attraction. It was also about protection. Married couples used amulets to safeguard their bond against jealousy, against infertility, against the wandering eyes of that charming priest's son who always accidentally shows up when your spouse is at the market. These charms were carved into jewellery, painted onto walls, or even baked into bread. Imagine biting into a loaf and realising it contains a message from your partner. Don't cheat or the gods will smite your kneecaps. Subtle. Protection spells were especially popular around childbirth. A woman giving birth was considered vulnerable, open to both physical danger and spiritual attack. Bes and Taure, the household gods, were often invoked to guard the mother, the baby, and the relationship that created them. Husbands would sometimes sleep near the entrance of the home, armed with amulets and possibly a stick, just in case any restless spirits came sniffing around. Now, not all spells were kind. Some were manipulative, even vengeful. There are ancient texts where a jilted lover curses the object of their affection. May their heart be confused, their feet stumble, and their dreams be filled with longing for me. One particularly salty curse written on a potsherd ends with, "May they be unable to eat bread without thinking of me, and may their beer turn sour in their mouth." That's the Egyptian version of leaving passive-aggressive notes on someone's mirror with coal. And this brings us to the ethical debate. Did these spells actually work? To the Egyptians, yes, absolutely. Magic was as real as gravity. It worked because the world was magical, but scholars today argue whether these spells were mostly symbolic, emotional rituals to help people cope, or whether people truly expected supernatural intervention. The answer, of course, is both. The line between faith and practicality was as thin as a strand of flax. Interestingly, many of these spells were written down by scribes, which means love magic wasn't confined to dark corners and whispered rumours. It was documented, cited, sometimes even sold. There were manuals, literal how-to guides, for getting someone to fall in love with you. Imagine walking into a scribe's office and ordering 1 breakup hex and a medium-strength desire spell, please. And can you make it smell like cinnamon? And sometimes people used magic not to gain love, but to end it. Severing spells, protective circles, even small, funerary rituals meant to put a relationship to rest without causing either party harm. Love might be divine, but it was also dangerous. It could destabilize families, provoke jealousy, or distract you from your duties. The gods didn't take kindly to obsession. You were supposed to love in balance. With joy, yes, but with caution. Too much passion could scorch your soul like an unfiltered sun. So imagine this. You're sitting in your home, your partner's dozing curled into the mat, the scent of frankincense lingering in the air. You glance at the little carved figurine of Taure on the shelf, hippopotamus-bodied, lion-pawed, always watching. You've tied your lives together not just with affection, but with thread, words and symbols. You've made your offerings, you've said your prayers, maybe you even buried a spell jar in the garden once just in case. And now everything's quiet. No hauntings, no wandering eyes, just peace. You smile, not because magic solved your problems, but because it gave you a way to care, a way to act, a way to hold love tightly, gently, but with both hands. In Egypt, love was never just an emotion. It was a craft, a ritual, a spell. And if you were lucky, it lasted long after the last candle burned low. The sun's high and the courtyard's quiet, too quiet, which usually means someone's either plotting something or writing about someone who is. Today, it's the latter, because as much as Egyptians cherished love, its perfume-slicked highs, its feasts, its hand-holding under the stars' sweetness, they were also excellent record keepers when love went wrong. And not just in courts or contracts. No, we're talking about the original receipts, letters. Tonight we dive into the juicy, nosy, heartfelt world of love letters and slander notes, where romance lives on pottery shards and heartbreak gets mailed with flair. Let's start with the love letters. These weren't just "I like you, do you like me" scribbles. They were poetic, heartfelt, sometimes desperate and always vivid. Picture this. You're a young man in Thebes working as a scribe's apprentice and you've just locked eyes with a girl carrying water jars. You go home, grab your reed pen and start to write. You compare her walk to the sway of a papyrus boat, her voice to harp strings, her breath to cinnamon. It's dramatic, yes, but you mean every word. Some letters were short and direct. I wait for you at the bend in the road. If you do not come, my heart will be like a broken pot. Others were elaborate, full of metaphors and celestial references. My heart flutters like the wings of the sacred falcon when I see you in your father's courtyard. The kind of thing that makes modern texts like "you up" feel extra tragic. Now, not everyone could write, but that didn't stop them. People hired scribes to compose their love letters, even if it meant parting with a loaf of bread or a shiny bead. Imagine dictating your deepest feelings to a guy whose day job is tallying taxes. Tell her I think about her more than the harvest. The scribe rolls his eyes but obliges. Love, after all, pays better than accounting. And then there's the other kind of writing. Not love letters, but their evil twins, slander notes. Because where there's passion, there's jealousy, suspicion, pettiness. And Egyptians, bless them, were absolutely not above airing out their dirty laundry in writing. Slander notes, often anonymous, sometimes accidentally left where others could find them, were little bombs of social sabotage. One might accuse a rival of seducing a married man. Another might hint that someone's love potion backfired and made their target ill. These weren't just gossip, they were weapons. Write the right rumour in the right place and suddenly someone's engagement collapses faster than a dried papyrus scroll in a flood. Fringe fact, we have actual examples of these on ostraka, broken pieces of pottery used for casual writing. Scribes and regular folks scribbled notes like, "She walks like a noblewoman but sleeps like a servant," or "He claims to love her, but I saw him with the brewer's daughter behind the shrine." Sometimes these were poetic, sometimes crude, and occasionally hilarious. One particularly vicious note reads, "His beard is fake, his sandals are borrowed, and he calls it love when it's just hunger." Oof! And yet sometimes even the slander gets romantic. You'll find a note where a man writes about a woman who wronged him, but by the end he's still begging her to return. "Let your anger fade like smoke. Come back before my bones forget your warmth." It's tragic, poetic, and embarrassingly relatable. Now, how private were these letters and notes really? That's up for scholarly debate. Some argue they were intended for discreet delivery, hidden in baskets, tucked into bundles of linen, slipped under doors. Others suggest they were semi-public performances, shared with friends, read aloud, passed around like gossip candy. In a world without mass media, personal writing was the drama. Love letters weren't just for the lover. They were for the community, the audience, the whispered conversations at the well. And that's not even getting into letters to the gods. If you were really desperate, you might write to Hathor or Bess and deposit the letter at a shrine. Something like, "Divine One, make him notice me. Make him stop speaking only to my cousin. Make him bring fish when he comes." It's equal parts prayer, complaint, and dating wish list. Of course, sometimes letters weren't written by the lover at all. They were about them. Parents, friends, neighbours, everyone had an opinion. One mother writes, "He is handsome but lazy, you deserve better." Another note warns a young man, "That girl smiles at everyone. Beware the one who brings honey to all but gives none to you." And just like today, those who interfered in love lives often meant well, and usually made things worse. Even tombs weren't safe. Some stelae, stone slabs, contain what appear to be love letters carved for eternity. A husband might declare his affection beside his wife's image. "She walked with grace upon the earth, and now she dances among the stars." Or in one case, "May the gods keep her spirit near mine, for I cannot follow yet." These inscriptions aren't just decorative, they're messages meant to travel across time, across worlds. And then there are the just-in-case letters. Letters written in anger, then buried, or burned, or never delivered. The ancient equivalent of, "I'm writing this to get it off my chest." One crumbled potsherd reads, "If you do not return by the next full moon, I will erase your name from my heart and from my door." Whether he came back or not, we'll never know. So now imagine this. You're sitting outside, the Nile glistening just beyond the wall. You hold a letter in your hand. You haven't opened it yet. You can feel the weight of the ink, the pressure of the reed pen, the indentations of someone's heartbeat made visible through careful script. Is it a confession, a farewell, a promise? You break the seal, and just like that, someone's voice rises from the clay and speaks straight to your heart. Because in ancient Egypt, love lived not just in touch and glance, but in every carefully inked line, every chipped shard, every note that outlived the lips that whispered it. It's festival season now. You can feel it in the air. buzzing with the smell of roasted goose, frankincense, and too many people packed into too small a space. Music drifts through the streets in soft bursts, harps, flutes, hand-clapping rhythm, and even the usually stern temple guards are smiling under their heavy eyeliner. Everywhere you look, people are dressed in their best linen, layered in turquoise and carnelian, dripping in perfume like walking flower markets. Welcome to the chaos and charm of Egyptian festivals, where love gets loud, public, and a little tipsy. The ancient Egyptians celebrated everything. Crop planting? Party. Good flood this year? Party. Full moon? Oh, definitely a party. But the ones that really stirred hearts and hips were the love-centred festivals, particularly those honouring Hathor and Bastet, two deities with a mutual reputation for sensuality, dancing and what we'll call relaxed social boundaries. Take the Festival of Hathor, for example. Held at Dendera, her sacred site, it was like Valentine's Day, Coachella, and a fertility ritual all rolled into one. Devotees, especially women, would travel there to pray for love, conception, pleasure, or just a break from daily life. And while there were formal rites, the real energy came from the music and mingling. Drummers kept the beat, dancers swayed with gold bells tied to their ankles, and if you happened to lock eyes with someone through the incense haze, well, that wasn't the goddess's fault. Beer flowed, heavily, because in Egyptian cosmology, intoxication wasn't just allowed, it was divine. Hathor herself once drank to the point of transformation. At these festivals, that buzz wasn't just for fun, it was seen as loosening the grip of daily life, softening the soul so it could love more freely. Some even called it ritual drunkenness, which is the most ancient excuse for getting sloppy in the name of romance you'll ever hear. One fringe tidbit. During certain festivals, men and women wore scent cones, small waxy domes placed on the head, slowly melting and releasing fragrant oils. And yes, it looked exactly as weird as it sounds. You've got dancers in sheer linen wearing giant cones of perfumed wax that drip down their braids as they flirt and twirl. Fashion statement? Olfactory romance enhancer? Probably both. Either way, if someone's cone melted fast, you knew they were dancing hard, or that it was going to be a steamy night. Then there was the Feast of Bastet in Bubastis, which Herodotus, never one to resist drama, claimed drew over 100,000 people. That number is probably exaggerated, but the spirit of it rings true. Wild river processions, boatloads of revellers, music, wine, and enough flirtation to make even Hathor blush. Bastet, the cat goddess of pleasure and protection, wasn't about celibate restraint. She was about joy, intimacy, and living fully in the moment. People went to her festival to dance, to laugh, to find partners, or just to remember what it felt like to be tzished. Now, scholars still debate how far these festivals actually went. Were they truly orgiastic, as some classical sources hint, or were they more structured, with flirtation and drinking contained within religious boundaries? The truth is probably somewhere in between. Think of them as ancient equivalents to modern music festivals, spiritual in intention, chaotic in practice. People didn't just go for love, they went to feel alive. And yes, these festivals sparked real relationships. Many couples traced their first meeting back to a crowded procession, a shared goblet of beer, or a clumsy attempt at dancing beside a sacred sycamore tree. There's even evidence that some marriage contracts mention festival seasons as starting points, like a spiritual Tinder swipe that led to a legal agreement. We met during the Feast of Hathor, and now I agree to bring her bread and oil for the rest of my life. Poetic, but not all festival romance was sunshine and love songs. With public celebration came public heartbreak. People reunited with exes. People saw their crush dancing with someone else. People got drunk and declared love they didn't really mean, or failed to speak when it mattered most. One Ostrakon fragment reads, "He laughed with me under Ra's light, but woke beside my sister." Ouch! Still, most Egyptians viewed festivals as opportunities. If your love life had gone dry, you dressed your best, walked into the crowd and let fate or the gods take over. You might come home with a new flame, or a new friend, or a really good story, or nothing at all, except the lingering scent of lotus oil and the memory of drums thudding in your ribs. Let's imagine it now. You're at a Hathor festival. You've been single too long, your sandals are dusty, and your friends are tired of your sighing. So you dress up. Not too much, just enough to feel new again. You join the crowd near the temple, shoulder to shoulder, with people of every age, class and shape. Someone hands you a cup, someone else smiles at you. A girl brushes past and your heart stumbles. The music starts. And for a moment, all your past heartbreak and confusion melts like the scent cone on your head. You're just a body in motion, a soul open to whatever comes next. Maybe it's a conversation, maybe it's a kiss, maybe it's nothing but the warm feeling of being seen in a sea of strangers. When the sun rises the next morning, some couples will still be wrapped in each other's arms, others will be strangers again. The streets will be quiet, the scent of incense will fade, and life will go on. But for a few hours, love ruled everything. Not behind closed doors, not in quiet letters or secret glances, but loud, sweaty, joyful and real. Because when Egyptians wanted to celebrate love, they didn't whisper. They danced. By now, you've danced under festival stars, read tear-stained love notes, and maybe even whispered a spell or two under your breath just to feel something. You've seen the honey and the heartbreak, the cuddles and the curses, but for this next part, let's shift the lens. Not everyone in ancient Egypt followed the script of marriage, children, and eternal bed-sharing under the stars. Some, by choice, accident, or fate, lived outside the couple-shaped box. And tonight, we're getting cozy with the single life, the celibate path, and everyone in between. So let's say you've made it to your late 20s and somehow through skill or sheer avoidance, you've dodged every marriage proposal thrown your way. Your aunt keeps giving you the look, your friends keep trying to just introduce you to someone at every feast, and your neighbours whisper that maybe you've taken a vow of silence, or simply have bad breath. But in truth, you're fine. More than fine. You're single in ancient Egypt, and while you may not be common, you're far from invisible. There's no formal word for bachelor or spinster in the Egyptian lexicon, no social label that damns you to the fringe. Sure, society prefers you to be paired up. It's safer, more economically stable, and, well, tomb space is cheaper when you split it. But single adults existed, and many of them lived just fine. Some were widowed and never remarried. Some worked too hard to bother. Others may have been queer, though ancient Egyptian texts are mostly quiet on same-sex relationships, with a few tantalizing exceptions. We'll get to that. In cities like Thebes or Memphis, especially among artisans and scribes, it wasn't unusual to find a person who lived alone, surrounded by books or tools or gods. Some took apprentices or lived with extended family. Others formed platonic partnerships, what we might call chosen family now. You might not have a spouse, but you had company, support, jokes, and someone to share your lentil stew with. One quirky example, a funerary stealer from Deir el Medina, refers to a woman named Tabet, who lived with her sister and made offerings for their parents. No mention of a husband, no children, no apologies. Just two sisters living together, running their household, honouring the dead, and probably giving side-eye to every married couple who fought over who forgot to feed the goat. And then there were the celibate few. In temple life, some priests and priestesses took vows of chastity, especially those serving purity-demanding deities like Nath or Amun. These weren't lifetime vows, always observed a period of ritual celibacy before returning to regular life. But others remained single for decades, married only to the divine. Their role was deeply respected, especially among the priestesses who embodied Hathor or Mut in sacred rites. No one questioned their worth or whispered about what went wrong. Their lives were seen as offerings in themselves. But not everyone single was single by choice. Some women were abandoned, some men lost partners early, others faced infertility or illness, which could complicate marriage prospects in a society where children were a major goal. And while these people might have faced challenges, fewer protections, gossip, the ache of loneliness, they weren't automatically cut off from community. In fact, many of them were integrated into extended households. Egyptian homes were multi-generational and flexible. Your cousin might move in after her divorce, your aunt's widowed brother might sleep in the courtyard room, and tell endless stories about the time he almost became a royal scribe but decided the ink life wasn't for him. These households were fluid, forgiving. You didn't need a spouse to belong. Now, here's the debate that still gives scholars paper cuts. Were same-sex relationships common in ancient Egypt? The evidence is frustratingly thin and maddeningly vague, but one story stands out, that of Neankhnum and Khnumhotep, two royal manicurists buried together in a shared tomb with unusually intimate artwork. They're shown embracing nose-to-nose, the Egyptian equivalent of a kiss, with inscriptions calling each other beloved and joined in life and death. Some say they were brothers, others insist they were partners. The truth? Lost to time, but undeniably close. Other possible references exist, fragments, half-lines in poems, ambiguous pronouns in love spells. Some argue that same-sex love was quietly accepted, especially if it didn't disrupt household structure. Others believe it was simply ignored, unacknowledged, unpunished, unrecorded. But given Egypt's flexibility on other social matters, it's hard to imagine that queer people didn't exist, love, and occasionally roll their eyes at the same drama everyone else endured. Fringe detail? There's an amulet that survives showing two male figures wrapped in lotus stems, heads bowed together, surrounded by symbols of joy and fertility. Some say it's a friendship charm, others whisper it's something more. Either way, it proves one thing. Love in Egypt was wide, weird, and wonderfully complex. So imagine this. You're single, maybe by choice, maybe not. You wake up, light your lamp, and go about your day. You tend your stall, you copy your scrolls, you pray, you laugh with the neighbour's kids, you sleep alone, yes, but not lonely. Because you've built a life full of rhythm and meaning. You bring offerings to your ancestors, you dance at the festivals, maybe you flirt, maybe you don't. But you are whole. In a culture obsessed with order and eternity, the Egyptians still left room for love in all its forms. Romantic, familial, spiritual, chosen, and even none at all. Because sometimes, in the quietest houses, the deepest peace is found. A bowl of warm stew, a clean floor, a night sky, and the sound of your own breath. Steady, certain, full of something that just might be joy. By now you know what it feels like to fall in love in ancient Egypt. To chase it, lose it, preserve it in stone or whisper it into spells. But here's the thing, no matter how magical or messy your romance is, eventually someone's going to want to talk about it. Out loud, in front of people. Because in Egypt, love wasn't just lived. It was performed, narrated, and sometimes very dramatically judged. Tonight, we're stepping into the shade of a sycamore tree to explore gossip, matchmaking, and the ancient art of talking about everyone else's business. Let's be honest. Egyptians loved a good story. Whether it was carved on a temple wall or muttered over baked fish in a neighbour's courtyard, storytelling was a way of life. And the favourite genre? Romantic scandal, who was seen with whom, who broke off a betrothal, who's still unmarried and clearly cursed. The streets might have been made of mud brick, but the social web stretched across them like finely woven linen. Picture this. You're a potter's apprentice walking through the market to deliver a new batch of bowls. You pass the weaver's stall and hear two older women clucking like hens in a granary. She was out with the butcher's son again, one whispers, and at that hour. I told you she'd never marry decently. The other one nods solemnly. And her poor mother, so sweet, never thought her daughter would be a festival girl. You keep walking. You'll hear the rest tomorrow. Gossip in ancient Egypt wasn't just idle chatter. It was social control. It reinforced expectations, marked boundaries, and sometimes helped move things along. If someone heard their name too many times connected to the same person, well, they might start taking that person seriously, or at least pretend to, just to get the neighbours off their back. And this, of course, leads us straight into matchmaking. In most Egyptian families, especially among artisans and scribes, matchmaking was a communal sport. Parents were involved, yes, but so were uncles, cousins, old friends, and even nosy neighbours with no formal invitation. Everyone knew someone who knew someone. My nephew works at the granary, steady hands, nice teeth. That girl from the olive grove, her family makes excellent vinegar. If your resume included owns a good donkey or has not yet thrown a jar in anger, you were already halfway to marriage. Matchmakers weren't necessarily professionals, but there were people with a reputation for arranging unions. Often midwives or market women, people who knew every family's secrets and weren't afraid to use that knowledge as leverage. They'd suggest matches at the temple festivals, over fence chats, or while pretending to casually examine onions. He's not much to look at, but he's honest and smells like cedar. That's rare these days. Sometimes matchmaking was done with full permission. Other times it was the ancient equivalent of being tricked into a double date. Oh, you're both here? What a surprise. Sit, drink, talk about goat prices. It might not be love at first sight, but it was exposure. And in a culture where courtship wasn't long or elaborate, that was usually enough to get things started. Now, scholars argue over how much autonomy people had in choosing partners. Legal records and poetry suggest that many Egyptians did choose their spouses, especially in the middle and lower classes. But parental approval still mattered. You couldn't just elope with the baker's son if your mother was saving you for someone with better grain access. Unless, of course, you really liked drama, which, fortunately for us, some people did. One preserved letter from a mother to her daughter reads, "You disgrace the house with your silence. If you do not write to explain this man, I will assume he has stolen your mind. That's code for, why haven't you told me about the man you're obviously seeing?" Egyptian mothers did not play around when it came to reputation. Still, not all matchmaking was successful. Some people were too picky, others had bad timing. One tale from a collection of papyrus stories tells of a man who rejected 3 brides in a row, claiming each had the wrong smile. In the 4th attempt, he finally married, only to discover she snored like a hippo and had no patience for nonsense. "He deserves her," the scribe adds dryly. Ancient burn. Fringe fact: some matchmakers used astrology to help seal the deal. Certain days were better for proposals, based on star alignments and lunar phases. If you met someone on the day sacred to Hathor, or under a favourable lunar aspect, it was considered especially auspicious. And if you met them on a bad omen day, say during the demon hours of Sekhmet's rage, maybe just go back inside. Gossip and matchmaking weren't always light-hearted though. They could carry weight, even when in danger. A badly placed rumour could ruin a reputation. A false accusation of infidelity or inappropriate behaviour might lead to social exile, or even legal action. Egypt had defamation laws, believe it or not. You couldn't just accuse someone of being a courtyard crawler and walk away unchallenged. Some disputes made it all the way to scribal courts, with witnesses testifying about what they saw and what she said to the beer seller's cousin. But for the most part, gossip was a pressure valve, a way to keep the social pot from boiling over, and every once in a while it did something surprisingly sweet. It nudged 2 lonely people together. It reminded a husband to be more attentive. It warned a girl away from a smooth-talking ox driver with too many bracelets. So imagine this. You're walking home one evening and someone you barely know says, "I heard you and Horemheb were at the fig stall together. Twice." You blink. You were. You didn't think anyone noticed. But now, you can't stop smiling. Maybe you'll stop by the fig stall again tomorrow. Maybe he'll be there. Maybe he'll ask. And just like that, love moves forward. Not through grand declarations, but through whispers, nudges, and very well-timed gossip. Because in ancient Egypt, love wasn't just between 2 people. It was everyone's favourite story. And here you are, back at home, candle burned low, your sandals kicked into the corner like they've seen things. You're thinking about everything now, the festivals and firelight, the scribbled notes on pottery, the whispers behind reed walls, the laughter over lentil stew. And it hits you. Love in ancient Egypt wasn't one thing. It was 1,000 small moments, lived and relived by millions of people just like you, who looked at someone else and thought, yes them. So tonight, for our final stretch, let's settle into the quiet corners and sacred spaces where love became legacy, not just a fleeting feeling, but something passed down, remembered, ritualized. Because for Egyptians, love didn't vanish when people died, or relationships ended, or the Nile flooded and ruined your goat pen. It lived on, in stories, in names, in careful records etched into limestone. Marriage and family weren't just private matters, they were community pillars, spiritual contracts, and cultural foundations. When someone said I love you, it wasn't just for now, it was for eternity. And eternity, as you might have noticed, was kind of a big deal here. Take the family stelae, tomb markers carved with inscriptions of spouses standing side by side, children at their feet, arms wrapped gently around each other. These weren't just decorations, they were promises. Here we are, we lived, we loved, we honoured the gods, remember us. Many included lines like, "My wife, the beloved of my heart," or "he, who pleased his wife with kindness." And these words weren't written for show, they were meant to guide the key, the soul, long after the body had turned to dust. Sometimes those inscriptions included subtle little digs too, because love is complicated. One stela implies the husband forgot to provide enough beer during festivals, but the wife forgave him anyway. Another praises a woman who kept her tongue mild even when her husband was stubborn. That's ancient Egyptian for, he was lucky I didn't throw a vase. Still, the love shines through, human, imperfect, enduring. And then there were household shrines, small altars tucked into corners of the home. Not just for gods, but for ancestors, for lost spouses, for children who never reached adulthood. Families lit candles, left food offerings, said prayers aloud. A woman might ask her late husband for guidance on raising their son. A man might leave a flower for the wife he missed every morning. These rituals weren't morbid, they were intimate, personal, a daily act of remembrance wrapped in tenderness. Even household items told love stories. In museums today, you'll find cosmetic jars shaped like hearts, spoons carved with scenes of couples embracing, amulets inscribed with private prayers. These weren't luxury goods for display. They were held, used, touched every day, absorbing the smells of oil and incense, the shape of a hand, the heat of a body beside another. They carried love like fingerprints pressed into clay. Fringe detail. Archaeologists have found tiny children's toys with parents' names written on them. Little painted animals, dolls with linen clothes, wooden games, all marked with the phrases like "from your mother who loves you," or "to my sweet son from your father who watches over you." These were tokens of affection, small but powerful. Proof that love in Egypt wasn't all dramatic poems and passionate curses. Sometimes it was just a carved hippo that made your child smile. There's also the curious case of love contracts. Beyond standard marriage agreements, some couples created personal pacts, handwritten notes promising to be kind, to share food equally, to not marry anyone else as long as their partner lived. They weren't always legally binding, but they were heartfelt. Imagine slipping one under your partner's plate during dinner. Promise to never forget me, even if the river swells and takes me away. Heavy, but kind of beautiful. And let's not forget how love filtered into education. Scribes in training didn't just copy tax forms. They practiced by transcribing poems, many of them love verses. Teen scribes learning to hold a stylus would end up with hands smudged in ink and heads filled with romantic metaphors. That means an entire generation of bureaucrats grew up accidentally memorizing lines like, "She passes and the sun hides from shame." Ancient Egypt, where even your math homework might accidentally make you a poet. Now you're probably wondering, how did it all end? Not just for individuals, but for this entire way of life. When did Egyptians stop loving like this? The truth is, they never really did. The kingdom changed, yes. Greeks came, then Romans, then others. But the echoes of this love culture lingered. You see it in early Coptic texts, in Arabic poetry, in the way Egyptian families today still light candles for ancestors and tell stories that stretch back a dozen generations. Because love in Egypt wasn't just emotion, it was structure. Woven into everything, the way you greeted someone, shared food, buried your dead, or painted your walls. It wasn't always grand or poetic. Sometimes it was hard, sometimes it broke people, but it was always present. So now, picture this. You're older, your hair's gone silver, the markets aren't as noisy, the kids are grown, the festival drums are more distant than they used to be. You sit outside your home in the late daylight, and beside you is someone. Maybe the one you married. Maybe just someone who stayed. You hand them a cup of beer and they give you the last date from the bowl without needing to be asked. No words, just a glance, a soft smile, and the long, slow heartbeat of shared years. That was love in ancient Egypt. So now the lamp is almost out, its glow reduced to a flicker, barely warming the walls. Outside, the crickets hum low over the Nile, and the breeze slips through the reeds like a whispered lullaby. You've walked through the temples and taverns, sat beneath painted tomb ceilings, eavesdropped on courtships and curses, and maybe, just maybe, fallen a little in love with how they loved. Ancient Egypt wasn't a place of cold marble or museum glass. It was warm skin, rough linen, shared bread, and the quiet bravery of loving someone enough to write it down in ink that would outlast you. You've seen marriages negotiated over dates and goats, wives who ran households like CEOs with eyeliner, husbands who cried in letters to the dead, and single scribes who lived quietly with their books in a garden. You've seen love in 1,000 forms, divine, desperate, rebellious ritual. It survived across classes, through dynasties, through centuries of sand and silence. And now you're here, thousands of years later, lying still under the same stars those lovers once watched. Maybe you've got someone beside you, maybe not, doesn't matter. The story is still yours. You carry it now. Every awkward flirtation, every whispered promise, every hard choice to stay or go, it's all ancient, and it's all new again. So close your eyes, let the Nile ripple past your ears one last time. You've travelled far, but love's always been right here, waiting in the dark. Thanks for staying until the end.